between January 29th and February 3rd and shared the BEI on February 4th to enable broad sharing. Now, according to your complaint, after virus samples were available to the U.S. government from the Washington state case, and potentially even after the CDC's effort to grow the virus and then share with the BEI biorepository, you were still seeking to obtain a sample of the virus, correct?
That's true, sir, but we need more than one virus.
Right, I'm going to get to that. Why were the strains not available within the U.S. government, not available to you? Were they available to you?
Sir, I was asking for viruses in January because we wanted to make sure that we had a head start on developing the vaccine.
Yeah, no, I get that.
When they became available in February, I believe it's February 6th, through the BEI resources, then those were distributed to laboratories.
Did you ask for the virus sample from Washington State that was part of that? You did?
I and BARDA did. We asked to make sure we had access to those viruses, and they were distributed to the right laboratories and the right companies.
And where did you ultimately get the virus that you distributed sample?
Some of those viruses came from the BEI resources at NIH, and some of those viruses came from laboratories that received the initial seed from CDC.
Okay, that's helpful to know. In some conversations I've been a part of with some at NIH, they indicated that the real key here was to get the DNA sequence, which China did eventually put up, I believe, at the end of December, early January. And that in terms of going after the vaccine, it was that sequencing that really mattered most to get started on vaccine development. And there are other scientists who are very distinguished who believe that the delay in getting the virus sample actually didn't set them back. Is that an accurate assessment, or do you just have a disagreement in that view? And I know scientists disagree, so do we up here. But I'm kind of hearing that having the sequencing really mattered most, and getting the virus important, but did not set them back in proceeding to get the vaccine and vaccine development underway.
Sir, China posted the first sequence on January 11th, I believe, or made it available January 10th or January 11th. It's important to understand that the sequence is available, when a sequence is available, some companies with some technologies can get started with that sequence information.
And
you still are vulnerable because you have another country in their laboratories that post it on the internet or a database of their sequence. So there could still be challenges, especially for national security, about the integrity of that sequence.
Yeah, before my time runs out, it's run out. I was just going to ask, did they begin efforts at that time once they got the sequence?
The NIH began efforts on a synthetic messenger RNA vaccine candidate. However, without the viruses, you really cannot tell if the neutralizing antibodies elicited by that, or your diagnostics, or your therapeutics can actually work. You can try to synthesize a virus with a sequence, but it's never going to be representative of the actual virus. And when we're spending billions of dollars on drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics, we want to have the most credible information possible.
Right. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding today's hearing. Doctor, if you were a betting man, sorry. Thank you. Doctor, if you were a betting man, when would you bet that we would that we would have a vaccine?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I know that there are companies in academic labs working very hard. Normally it takes up to 10 years to make a vaccine. We've done it faster in emergency situations, but from when we had starting material in the freezer for Ebola. But for a novel virus, it's actually haven't been done yet that quickly. So a lot of optimism is swirling around a 12 to 18 month time frame. If everything goes perfectly, we've never seen everything go perfectly. My concern is if we rush too quickly and consider cutting out critical steps, we may not have a full assessment of the safety of that vaccine. So it's still going to take some time. I still think 12 to 18 months is an aggressive schedule. And I think it's going to take longer than that to do so.
12 to 18 months from now, or 12 to 18 months from when this all started, the beginning of the year?
It would be 12 to 18 months from when the particular manufacturers first received the material or information that they needed to start developing that vaccine. It's critical to note when we say 12 to 18 months, that doesn't mean for an FDA-approved vaccine. That means to have sufficient data and information on the safety and immunogenicity, if not efficacy, to be able to use on an emergency basis. And that is the consideration that we have in mind when we talk about an accelerated timeline.
Thank you. I represent in New York, Bronx County and Westchester County, which are at the epicenter of the U.S. Coronavirus outbreak, New Rochelle, New York. While New Yorkers have really rallied together in support of their neighbors, the administration has failed at every turn. The President has sidelined our best scientists, pushed baseless conspiracy theories, and more recently prescribed unproven remedies like Lysol to suffering Americans. Since the early days of the outbreak, the President encouraged doctors to prescribe chloroquine to suffering Americans despite a lack of evidence supporting its use. On April 24th, the President's hand-picked FDA commissioner even came out against the use of chloroquine for COVID-19 cases. Doctor, what are the dangers of chloroquine if prescribed incorrectly, and what happened when you raised the issue of chloroquine use in coronavirus patients with HHS leadership?
Congressman, our concern centered around the potential use of chloroquine in people who were infected with this coronavirus. There are data of the effective use and safe use of chloroquine in malaria patients and other indications. We also knew that there were potential safety risks with chloroquine to cause irregular heart rhythms and even in some cases death. So our concern was with limited information and knowledge, especially of its use in COVID-19 infected patients and the potential for those risks, then we should make sure that any studies with that drug were done in a carefully controlled clinical study under close watchful eye of a physician so they could respond to a patient if they did experience one of those adverse events. There wasn't sufficient data at that time to support use of this drug in patients with COVID-19 without close physician supervision.
And when you raised that issue of chloroquine use in coronavirus patients with HHS leadership, what happened to you? You were removed as a director of BARDA. Is that not true?
I believe part of the removal process for me was initiated because of a push back that I gave when they asked me to put in place an expanded access protocol that would make chloroquine more freely available to Americans that were not under the close supervision of a physician and may not even be confirmed to be infected with the coronavirus. The scientists at FDA, BARDA, and NIH and CDC worked hard to switch that to an emergency use authorization with strict guardrails that the patients would be in a hospital confirmed to be infected with this virus under close supervision of a doctor and who could not otherwise participate in a randomized controlled study. My concerns were alleviated somewhat by being able to lock that in the stockpile with those conditions. However, my concerns were escalated when I learned that leadership in the Department of Health and Human Services were pushing to make that drug available outside of this emergency use authorization to flood New York and New Jersey with this drug, regardless of the EUA. And when I spoke outside of our government and shared my concerns for the American public, that, I believe, was the straw that broke the camel's back and escalated my removal.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Gentleman's time has expired. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Bright, for being here. We appreciate it very much. Reading through your complaint, I just kind of want to point out, I think the chairman said earlier, talked about the lack of urgency and implies the president's lack of urgency. I think most of my constituents want to know that things are getting done and where is the president on this. And you're having issues with the leadership at Health and Human Services, and you're giving them recommendations. So if they're not accepting your recommendation to them, I I think fairly surmise they're not passing that on to the White House. So the president's probably unaware of what you're putting forth, because it says, in reading from your complaint on page 23, fortunately, White House Trade Advisor Peter Navarro shared Dr. Bright's sense of urgency. So that's in your sense of urgency. So talking about the urgency in the White House, so you have a meeting with him on Saturday. He calls you back in on Sunday, where you prepare your recommendations in a memo for Mick Mulvaney, Chief of Staff, so essentially the president. And then, so you get around the leadership of HHS, meet essentially with the president, since with Mick Mulvaney, and it says, you have the meeting with Navarro on Saturday, the memorandum of Mick Mulvaney on Sunday, and on Monday, it says the National Security Council Policy Coordinating Committee met and directed Dr. Kalik and HHS to implement Navarro's recommendations. The push by the White House for HHS to act more swiftly created tension between Dr. Bright and HHS political leadership. So it seems, I don't know how you could be more urgent in government than having a meeting on Saturday, a memorandum on Sunday, and actions on Monday, once it got to the president's attention, the president's level. So we appreciate the president moving forward on that. I'm on the ranking member of O&I, which the investigations, which you've testified in front of us before, and we appreciate that very much. So I'm kind of looking more at the process of putting this hearing together and some things. As we read through your complaint, the only way we have is because you made it public. And in your complaint, there are different exhibits that you talk about, and we're having a hearing today, and there are actually 33 exhibits referenced in your complaint that's not public. I think we got them from the majority through the Washington Post or something like that. That's how we were made documents available for this hearing, in my understanding. So the 33 exhibits that are not made public, that are referenced in your complaint, would you make those available to the committee? Do you have those and make them available to the committee? I mean, if we're using your complaint for this hearing, we need to have the documentation.
May I address that?
With the chair, I don't have a problem with you addressing.
Yes, we will take that under advisement and get back to you.
Okay. Also, when we read through
There may be privacy considerations in some of the documents, so we do need to look at these documents carefully.
so also, if we read through the email chains that are made available, some appear complete, but some truly aren't. They're apparently not full email chains. And so you will wonder if the context of the email would relate to the inferences taken from the emails. Would you make all the complete email chains available to us?
I'd like to address that as well, which is a problem is when Dr. Bright was removed from his position, he was locked out of his email. He does not have access to his full email.
So the email chain, the email chains that you have available, we have.
That's correct.
I can
He does
address
not have a full set of his email.
I can address this too. Yeah, that's exactly right. So I was immediately locked out of my email on April 20th of this year. And so I didn't have full records available to me and that. However, I believe I've laid a solid foundation in my complaint, as detailed as I could be, for the Office of Special Counsel to be able to conduct an investigation. I believe as part of their investigation, they'll be able to access those emails and individuals to get a full story and get the full information so they can get to the bottom of it.
It would have been helpful for us as well. Have you shared any of these exhibits with the majority that's not been shared with us in the minority side?
Sir, I believe you have probably what's available in the public domain, and I believe the rest has been submitted to the Office of the Special Counsel, and I haven't made it available to anyone directly.
To the gentleman, the minority and majority members all received the same packet of information.
Which is available to the
emails,
public.
yeah, that was available, that was in the public domain.
Okay. So just one more, are there any other documents in your possession or accessible to you that are not included as exhibits in the complaint, but are nonetheless relevant to your allegations? If so, will you provide those to the committee?
I believe I've provided the information I have available to me at this point. If I had access to my email from HHS, there might be additional supporting information in that email. I do not know the status, if that's been deleted or wiped, or I just haven't had access to it since April 20th.
Okay, what you have access to. I appreciate your answers. Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and to you, Dr. Bright, thank you, sir, for coming today, and thank you, most importantly, for your 25 years of public service. Dr. Bright, I'd like to ask you about your efforts to address supply shortages for administering COVID-19 tests. According to your account, as COVID-19 testing ramped up, you asked for an inventory of the strategic national supply availability of testing supplies, including swabs, viral transport materials, and extraction buffers. You learned that the national stockpile did not stock these items. After that, you learned that FDA's source of swabs was a manufacturer in the region of Italy, which was the center of the COVID-19 outbreak in Italy. It is my understanding that this information then prompted you to reach out to the DoD agency that had previously assisted your office with international transportation of supplies related to Ebola. My question is, why, sir, did your office contact DoD at this point?
Sir, it was quite a surprise to me that the urgent ramp-up of the testing did not include full consideration of all the critical supplies needed to support that ramp-up of testing, including those materials you mentioned, swabs, viral transport media, buffers, et cetera. And I was quite alarmed to learn from sitting behind CDC Director Redfield that we were going to experience this shortage of swabs. And I was even more surprised that our strategic national stockpile did not plan or have any of those in supply. So my urgency to find a solution to that was supported by the FDA director of the Center for CDRH, who does devices and diagnostics at FDA. And once I confirmed that there was a shortage, it was critical that we find a solution. And that was by partnering with our Department of Defense colleagues who work with us for the Ebola response. We actually work with them to ship doses of Ebola vaccine from Germany to the United States so it can be filled rapidly to respond to the outbreak in Africa. So it was a natural occurrence or response for me and my colleagues in BARDA to come up with a solution to that critical supply chain.
Let me ask you this, were there any restrictions in place in Italy that would require Secretary Azar to move forward with the request to DoD?
What we needed to enact that air bridge with the Department of Defense was we needed our Secretary Azar to make a request of the Secretary of Defense. And I and my colleague, Dr. Gary Dispro, raised this issue at our senior leadership meeting with Dr. Kadlec, who chairs that meeting, the ASPR. And it clearly was not a topic that he wanted to discuss on that day. And actually, we were rebuffed by him saying that he did not really want to talk about swabs right now. And both Dr. Dispro and I raised this concern repeatedly in that call. So knowing that it was critical and time sensitive, and we had a critical shortage of these swabs, I placed a call to Mr. Navarro's office once again and asked if Mr. Navarro could offer some assistance in contacting the Secretary of Defense to get clearance for DoD to put those airplanes in place under the contract we have. And that happened in a very quick turnaround, a matter of minutes. With that permission from the Secretary of Defense, we were able to start those flights within 2 days. We have now transferred back over 25 million swabs.
So you're saying that you alerted White House Advisor Peter Navarro about this issue, is that right?
Yes.
And within hours, literally within hours, he had coordinated with DoD to start these flights to transport the swabs?
Yes, sir.
Correct. This seems like a logical response to the analysis that you provided. What is truly perplexing to me is why anyone would resist such an initiative. That's a rhetorical question. I won't ask you to answer that. Finally, we still don't have enough testing supplies. I don't understand how and why that is possible. I understand that converting an auto plant to build ventilators might take a little time, but how can we be struggling to get adequate supplies of simple supplies like swabs? What does this say about the federal response to the coronavirus outbreak?
It says to me, sir, that there is no master coordinated plan on how to respond to this outbreak. We don't have a strategy or plan in place that identifies each of those critical components, and we don't have a designated agency that is sourcing those critical components and coming up with a strategy to make sure that we have those supplies when we need them. We need this comprehensive national strategy that's end-to-end about what includes every component to make sure we can respond and protect American lives.
Thank you, Dr. Bright. You're a great American. Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for his 5 minutes questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Chairman, appreciate it. It seems like Mr. Navarro's done a pretty good job in listening to the questions. I do wish we had more of the information available, and it's one of the reasons why it's not your fault, but why I wish we had done this through the regular channels. But I would ask this on some of the questions that were just asked about supplies being available. I kind of got the impression from prior testimony that Project BioShield, which you urged us to put money into, and we put $700 million in 18 and 735 in 15 and 19, was supposed to take care of some of that. Am I misunderstanding Project BioShield?
Project BioShield is used to invest in late-stage development of drugs and vaccines, primarily, and some diagnostics. And
so that didn't help on this at all?
It didn't help on this at all, sir.
All right. Now, that being said, and I did say, and I would hope that we would have had everything available to us, and I understand that may not be your fault, but it does create issues. But everything's going crazy. The people have all kinds of things going on. And this hydroxychloroquine comes up, and there's some email exchanges in Exhibit 54 from your documents indicate that Christopher Houchins writes, and he says, we should probably take a look at this. I'm paraphrasing, but the line I took out of it was, especially when we have few or no options. One of the frustrations I have had for years with our community trying to respond to all kinds of different diseases is we want to have the double-blind studies in place. We want to have all the science there, which makes sense if you have an alternative. But when you have few or no options, it seems to me you would go after those things that are available. And if hydroxychloroquine is one at one point, then remdesivir, I'm assuming, have they done the double-blind studies related to COVID on remdesivir? Has that already happened? And then I've got an article from the Richmond Times-Dispatch, April 15th, where a doctor used high doses of vitamin C and a drug called Actemra, also an Actemra. All of these are floating out there. Doctors are using all kinds of things because we don't have other options. And so I'm wondering, what was the great hesitancy to at least let doctors try, and even if anecdotally it was having some effect, wouldn't you have to have that available in order to be able to do the tests? And if you've got few or no options, why wouldn't you want to go down that pathway?
We want to make sure that the drugs that we consider are safe and effective. The highest priority is safety. So many of these studies that we had, or anecdotal evidence or reports we had, did not include a thorough safety vetting of those drugs. There are some known side effects with some of the drugs. Many of these drugs were repurposed, so they weren't built de novo. So we knew about some of those potential safety concerns. And we didn't have any evidence of how those safety concerns would appear in people infected with this virus. This virus takes over a lot of your body and actually infects multiple organs in your body and causes significant inflammation and multi-organ shutdown in some cases before death. And acute respiratory distress syndrome, it really turns your lungs into a brick.
It's scary stuff. And you said, though, on hydroxychloroquine that one of the problems was you might have a irregular heartbeat. If you're worried about not having a heartbeat at all, that's really not, you're not worried about irregular if you don't have one at all. Am I not correct about that? I mean, that's the concern. People were dying out there, and here was the first one that showed some promise. Why wouldn't we want to accept, an offer from a manufacturer to give us a lot of this and have it out there for widespread use if the doctors chose, just like the doctor in Richmond? That didn't work in that case. They actually used it in that case, and it didn't work. So he tried something else. I mean, I think that's really what we're going to have to do in an emergency situation. Am I not correct?
We need to do it carefully, sir. We have to make sure that when we have that information available with those potential drugs available, we are thinking outside the box.
Can't we be so careful that we actually accidentally kill people?
We need to move swiftly, sir. And we've actually to show that we could put up a clinical study in the matter of less than a week.
Okay.
It's important to use the available clinical data. And if we know there are potential risks, we need to make sure that we're cognizant of those risks and make sure those drugs are used in a very safe and controlled manner.
Yes, sir. And I appreciate that. And let me just say this. It's our job to ask some tough questions sometimes, but just like you found friendly ears at the White House, you might have found some friendly ears on our side of the aisle here as well. And I would note that in 2018, you were talking about vaccines and you were talking about offshore production. And I said, let me know what I can do to help get more production onshore, but I never heard from you. I'm happy to help. I want onshore production. I'm with you on a lot of these issues. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. We've got to investigate that. Today, unfortunately, was not the day to do that investigation. We don't have enough information. A lot of stuff is not here for us, but don't hesitate in the future. If you see something, let us know on both sides of the aisle what's going on. I appreciate it, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Matsui, for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Dr. Bright, for appearing before us today, and thank you for your public service. Dr. Bright, you described a series of missed opportunities that have left our country woefully unprepared for the pandemic's impact. Many Americans are eager to return to normalcy, as we can all understand, but to even begin safely reopening, we need widespread testing capacity, an organized contract tracing workforce, and a healthcare system that can handle further surge. And ultimately, a vaccine or therapeutic cure is required. I'd like to ask you a series of questions about your warnings to the administration while at BARDA. I'm hoping you can succinctly answer whether you believe each scenario will ultimately shorten or lengthen the time it takes for our country to safely reopen and recover from the coronavirus pandemic. On January 10th, you began pushing HHS leadership to obtain sequencing of virus samples. Given the importance of these samples for vaccine and diagnostic development, has the administration's inaction shortened or lengthened our timeline for reopening?
Those samples were critical to get started as early as possible. There was delay in getting those samples. That means there'll be delay in getting those countermeasures.
So
those countermeasures are critical to reopening our country.
Okay. Throughout the month of January, you made HHS aware of the urgent need to increase funding to combat the virus. HHS leadership believed that BARDA's budget was sufficient. Has the delay of these resources shortened or lengthened our timeline for reopening?
The delay of those resources have extended the timeline to make drugs available and vaccines. Sure. Therefore, it's extended our ability to respond to this pandemic.
On January 18th, you pushed Dr. Cadillac to coordinate COVID-19 planning activities across the government. Dr. Cadillac initially rejected your request, suggesting it was not time sensitive. Did this delay in coordination shorten or lengthen our timeline for reopening?
That lengthened the timeline for our reopening. We needed those early policy discussions to happen as soon as possible.
From January through March, you pushed for HHS to ramp up production of the N95 masks, swabs, and syringes. HHS failed to act quickly. Has this inaction shortened or lengthened our timeline to reopening?
That inaction has put a lot of lives at risk, and our frontline healthcare workers, in no time to reopen our country, will bring those people back to us.
Certainly. Thank you, Dr. Bright. Of course, there are many decisions made outside of these scenarios that influence when we can safely reopen. But from what I'm hearing today, HHS, if they heeded your warnings early, we could have proactively limited the toll this pandemic is taking on our country. It appears clear from the whistleblower report that the Trump administration prioritized political calculations above public health with regard to chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. Despite the lack of data supporting the clinical benefits for the treatment and prevention of COVID-19, the Trump administration promoted the drug's use to the American people because it was seen as a big, immediate win. Dr. Bright, do you believe there are other instances where the administration relied on politics rather than science to make coronavirus response decisions? And what consequences might those decisions have had on public health?
We have a very rigorous scientific review process for all of the investments that we make for the drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics through BARDA and through our department, actually. And so there were some attempts to bypass that rigorous vetting process that caused me great concern and actually increased the tension between me and Dr. Cadillac. without that scientific vetting, that does increase the risk of a drug being evaluated or supported that could have safety concerns. And we really needed to have the best scientists in our country weigh in on whether or not that drug should be evaluated and how it should be evaluated to address those safety concerns.
Certainly. The Trump administration waited until April to invoke the Defense Production Act to increase the production of life-saving medical supplies like masks, months after doctors began experiencing shortages, and 3 months after your initial January warnings. Should HHS have invoked the Defense Act earlier to increase the domestic production of critical medical supplies like masks and swabs?
I'm not an expert on the Defense Production Act and how it's used most effectively. I do believe that we should have been doing everything possible, placing orders early, ramping up supply, ramping up production of those critical medical equipment as quickly as possible, whether or not that's through the Defense Production Act or other mechanisms. It should have been a high priority.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Bright. I run out of time, and thank you very much for appearing before us today.
The gentlewoman yields back. A pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis,
Thank you,
for his
Madam
5
Chair.
minutes.
I appreciate it very much, and I want to thank Dr. Bright as well for your service to our country. I have a few questions, and I'm focusing on the hydroxychloroquine. When was the potential use of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine as treatment for the COVID-19 first brought to your attention, sir?
I believe it's probably mid-March, between March 10th and March 17th, somewhere in that time frame.
And not prior to that?
Not that I recall. The first I heard of the drug itself was a call I received from Dr. Woodcock at the FDA asking if I'd heard of the drug. And I hadn't heard of the drug, and I hadn't heard of its potential use for COVID-19 patients. She said there might be something interesting to look at. And she forwarded a manuscript, a draft manuscript, and that's the first I learned of the drug itself.
So you weren't aware of any news articles and research papers in January discussing the potential benefits of the drug?
I had heard anecdotal stories and reports, sir.
You had?
I had probably, I can't recall if I did specifically for chloroquine, but I tried to track the media and the scientific journal as well. However, I rely on the guidance of the science within HHS, and the first I had heard of that was from my colleague, Dr. Woodcock at the FDA, and then a summary report from our scientists at FDA, CDC, NIH, and BARDA that indicated that the evidence for its benefit was weak and the evidence for its safety concerns was stronger. And they did not believe at that point it was something that should be supported.
Okay, now, again, what was your reaction personally? Did you think it was something worth pursuing initially when you heard it from Dr. Woodcock?
Initially, I said I do believe, I trust Dr. Woodcock and her scientific judgment immensely. And if she mentioned that it's something that we should look at, then it's something we should consider testing in a randomized controlled clinical study, I would be supportive of the team reviewing that protocol and that information to see if it should be used.
Sir, I understand, I've heard from experts, and I'm certainly not an expert in this area, that the drug, the one that we're talking about, in this case, hydroxychloroquine, if it's used, first of all, timely, because I understand there's a window there as far as the patient, the efficacy of the drug. Have you heard this, that if it's administered properly, there's a small window there for the patient as far as risk is concerned? Can you elaborate a little bit on that if you've heard that? And again, this is not from a layperson, this is from an expert.
We have seen heard of anecdotal data from different physicians that they believe they've seen benefit or patient improvement from use of this drug in either combination with antibiotic azithromycin or a combination with zinc or other vitamin C or other things, but there was never sufficient evidence from a randomized controlled study to show its benefit would actually outweigh the potential risk. That is why the NIH and probably 40 other institutions around the world are conducting randomized controlled clinical studies to look at the benefit either in late stage treatment or early stage treatment. Most of the data coming out from those clinical studies to date haven't shown an overwhelming level of evidence that it has benefits in those patients. Doesn't mean that it might still have some benefit in individuals or a case or two in different studies, or that physicians believe they see a benefit in their patients. But in the context of a randomized controlled study, we haven't seen an overwhelming level of benefit.
Have you reviewed the studies in other countries such as France and possibly Japan on these? I mean, are you, I just want to know, because my constituents ask these questions, do you take those studies into consideration when you make these decisions?
We absolutely do. We look at the quality of those studies. We understand, look to see if they were done with the right controls in place and the right sample size. Was it statistically relevant, or was it just a few people, or was it 20 people, or was it 2,000 people? All of that adds to the power of the data itself. Many of the studies that we saw early only included a few number of patients, and so it was unclear, even from the description of some of those studies that were not in peer-reviewed journals, whether all the patients were treated the same, whether they had full participation throughout the clinical study itself. And looking at the statistical power of many of those studies, they were very small. So it was really difficult to understand the impact, the benefit. We also saw a study that the VA hospital conducted with hydroxychloroquine that showed people who were treated with hydroxychloroquine appeared to have a higher rate of death than people who are not treated with hydroxychloroquine. So that study too has weaknesses. No study is actually perfect. You take all of that evidence into account when you make a decision on how to further study the drug or how to use that drug.
It's my understanding that not my constituent, but a U.S. citizen a veteran, was cured. Again, this is just from what I heard from the drug. And that was a late stage case, but I've also heard of early stage cases as well. So I wanted to get that on record. Thank you, Madam Chair.
He yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Castor, for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Bright, thank you for speaking out to save lives. I read your whistleblower filing, and I want to ask you about the N95 respirators. These respirators are essential personal protective equipment. They're not the cloth mask or surgical mask that everyday Americans are encouraged to wear by the CDC. Dr. Bright, are N95 respirators necessary to protect the lives of nurses, doctors, EMTs, and those on the front lines?
Yes, they're required essential personal protective equipment to protect those frontline healthcare workers from getting infected.
And this is not a hypothetical concern. Just last week, the LA Times reported a tragic story about a heroic nurse, Celia Marcos, who appears to have died because she lacked an N95 respirator when she rushed into a hospital room to try to save a COVID-19 patient who had stopped breathing. And this brave nurse is not the only one. According to another report, over 700 staff at just one Detroit area health system have tested positive for COVID-19, and the CDC reported over a month ago that over 9,000 healthcare workers had already contracted COVID and dozens have died. And I checked with my Tampa Bay area health providers, and one Tampa hospital said N95s are still very difficult to procure. She said there's a dire need for N95s. One of my community health centers says we continue to struggle to get N95s. And there's so many folks trying to sell knockoffs. And then a large Tampa Bay area health system said the supply chain remains inconsistent and irregular, and Baycare remains concerned as we head into the fall for N95 masks. The demand will continue to increase due to the flu season and the continued presence of COVID-19. Dr. Bright, you understood that America would face a shortage of respirators in January. Is that right?
We understood America would face a shortage of N95 respirators for a pandemic response in 2007. And we have exercised and known and evaluated that number almost every year since 2007. It was exercised even as late as early as 2019, August, in Crimson Contagion, that we would need 3.5 billion N95 respirators in our stockpile to protect our healthcare workers from a pandemic response.
And you sounded the alarm repeatedly, but were ignored by the senior leadership at the Department of Health and Human Services. Please explain what steps that you took and the response you received.
We knew going into this pandemic that critical medical equipment would be in short supply. I began getting alerts from industry colleagues in mid and late January, telling me that from an outside view, from the industry view, that the supply chain was diminishing rapidly, telling me that other countries that we relied on to supply many of these masks were blocking export and stopping transfer of those masks to the United States. I learned that China was trying to buy the equipment from the United States producers to have it shipped to China so they could make more. In each of these alerts, and there were dozens of these alerts, I pushed those forward to our leadership in ASPR, to Dr. Cadillac and his senior leadership team. I pushed those warnings to our critical infrastructure protection team. I pushed those warnings to our strategic national stockpile team, who has the responsibility of procuring those medical supplies for our stockpile. In each of those, I was met with indifference, saying they were either too busy, they didn't have a plan, they didn't know who was responsible for procuring those. In some cases, they had a sick child and would get back to it later in the week. A number of excuses, but never to manufacturers or producers of those masks. A 5-page survey asking producers or companies if they actually made those masks.
In your whistleblower filing, you discuss a February 7th meeting of the department leadership group at which you urged the department to focus on securing N95 masks.
People who should not be wearing those masks, so that would save those masks for our healthcare workers. My response was, I cannot believe you can sit and say that with a straight face. That was absurd.
In fact, it took 3 months from your initial warnings until mid-April for the federal government to invoke its authority under the Defense Production Act to require the production of millions of more N95 masks. And even then, the administration required the production of only 39 million masks, which is far fewer than you and other experts said that we would need. What was the consequence of this 3-month delay and inadequate response? Were lives endangered?
Lives were endangered, and I believe lives were lost. And not only that, we were forced to procure these supplies from other countries without the right quality standards. So even our doctors and nurses in the hospitals today are wearing N95 marked masks from other countries that are not providing the sufficient protection that a U.S. standard N95 mask would provide them. Some of those masks are only 30% effective. Therefore, nurses are rushing in the hospitals thinking they're protected, and they're not.
Thank you for your courageous effort.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. A pleasure to recognize our colleague from Indiana, Dr. Bouchon, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Dr. Bright, for testifying. I appreciate it. I was a cardiovascular and thoracic surgeon and been in healthcare for over 30-some years, so I want to comment on, I'm not going to ask a question about hydroxychloroquine. I just want to comment on how the medical community responds to this type of thing. Doctors across the country will use drugs off-label in a circumstance where they don't have or they don't see a viable alternative to that. And I think this is one of those circumstances. I'm hearing from doctors across the country. And look, I'm with you. You have to have double-blind studies. You have to have proof under normal circumstances. But in this situation, I think a little bit of understanding and leeway from the federal government is in order. We do want to ensure the safety. This is a drug that has been proven safe for many, many years in the appropriate doses. It does prolong the QT interval, as you've outlined, which can lead to cardiac arrhythmias if not used properly. But I mean, tell you, when states tried to stop doctors from using this, there was such a backlash, they had to back away from it because the physicians in the community wanted to use it. And so doctors like me out in the real world, if things are working, even anecdotally, they're not going to wait for the government bureaucracy to approve it. I just want to get that on the record. I'm just saying this is why doctors are using this drug. Whether it's right or not, data will show. But, if 2 years from now we have the studies and we say, hey, that stuff really would have worked, and the government stopped that from being used, if I was a family of a person that was stopped from getting hydroxychloroquine, I'd be pretty mad. I want to talk about the supply chain issues and as it relates to PPE, the personal protective equipment. And I think there's enough blame to go around in the federal government about what happened there. After H1N1, where our national stockpiles were depleted, we didn't replenish them. We've had people on both sides of the aisle talking about this, and I think there's some blame to go around. But I don't want to be accusatory, but I do want to go over some of the facts about BARDA's situation as it relates to the masks, okay? And according to Washington Post report, in 2015, the Obama administration and a company now known as O&M Halyard, Halyard, announced a project to develop rapid pandemic mask production line. According to federal contracting records in 2017, HHS signed off on a $3.3 million, with an M, payment to Halyard to build a machine that could churn out millions of protective respiratory masks at a high rate of speed during a pandemic. However, in September of 2018, CNBC reported that the machine was never built. And despite BARDA's $1.5 billion with a B budget, the Washington Post reported there wasn't money to pay for the project. Why was the project scrapped, and did you sign off on that decision?
So that project with Halyard was to build a novel new machine to make a respiratory protection face mask faster, as you described accurately. Right. Actually, the technical team must have reviewed that proposal on the next step or the further investment in that machine. I believe that the investment to date was made to design the machine, build the blueprint of the machine, and I'm not even sure if it was to build
at that time in September 2018, were you the head of BARDA?
In 2018, I was the director of BARDA.
Right, so did you sign off on the decision? Because I would expect a decision like that, a contract, money was allocated apparently from HHS to BARDA to do this. I wouldn't expect that to be scrapped without the director of BARDA signing off on that, right? So did you sign off on it? It's a yes or no question.
Not necessarily scrap the project, sir. I don't know what the proposal was. That we rely on a very thorough vetting process in our contracting office. So that proposal to further continue that project never made it to me. So if it wasn't approved, it didn't make it through the proper vetting process in BARDA. The decision to end or continue that project was not brought to me.
Okay, I find that surprising, but I'll take your word for it. Nicole Lurie, who hired you, told the Washington Post that the Halyard contract was part of an explicit strategy to ensure we could surge mass production in the next crisis. Well, now we're here and we don't have it. So we're dealing with the consequences of that decision. And in addition, I guess, to the Halyard, I keep saying that wrong. It is my understanding, well, I'm running out of time. So what I'm going to just say is, look, to doctors across America, it's easy for us to sit in Washington, D.C., whether we're members of Congress or whether we're agencies, and talk in the abstract about people dying in our intensive care units. But when you're the physician at the bedside and there is a medication that has promise and that has a safety profile that we understand, doctors will use this medication offline. And that's what's happening. And whether that's right or wrong, we might take us years to prove, but in the meantime, people can die. So I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. It's a pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Bright, welcome back to this committee. The United States government deploys millions of dedicated public servants working together to achieve our shared goals as a nation, to promote effective government, and to protect the public interest, in this instance, to protect the public health. As a scientist and public health official, that was your charge, and you took it seriously. Unfortunately, the record shows that your superiors at HHS and potentially beyond, instead of valuing your expertise and experience, squandered it in ways that in this moment, in the face of this crisis, amount to gross negligence. They ignored your science-based pleas to pursue critical strategies, for example, your repeated calls to obtain virus samples from China and to find supplies, masks, respirators, swabs. They dismissed your science-based warnings about pursuing unproven strategies. They dismissed your concern, for example, about the stampeding towards hydroxychloroquine. We've heard about that today. And they sent you on errant missions to find treatments with little therapeutic value, all for the sake of satisfying political cronies. And you've testified about the miracle cure drug that was an example of that. Ignoring, dismissing your input was not harmless malpractice, because there's every reason to believe that if that input had been heeded, particularly your pleas for action in the early days of the pandemic, it might have saved thousands of lives. I want to thank you for coming forward. I want to thank you for blowing the whistle on the misguided and chaotic response to this pandemic. I am sure there are specific conversations, emails, moments in time that you remember like they happened yesterday. The inflection points where if the response to your warnings had been heeded, things might have been different. And I'm sure they haunt you and keep you up at night. From January of this year, tell me about just one specific moment when you had that sinking feeling in the pit of your stomach because you were not seeing the response that you knew needed to happen.
Congressman, I'll never forget the emails I received from Mike Bowen and indicating that our mask supply, our N95 respirator supply was completely decimated. And he said, we're in deep shit. The world is, and we need to act. And I pushed that forward to the highest levels I could in HHS and got no response. From that moment, I knew that we were going to have a crisis for our healthcare workers because we were not taking action. We were already behind the ball. That was our last window of opportunity to turn on that production to save the lives of those healthcare workers, and we didn't act.
Listening to your testimony gives me chills because it all adds up to one inescapable conclusion. It didn't have to be this way. There was another path. Things could have gone differently. The federal response to the pandemic could have been much more effective. So here we are, at a moment when our country needs the kind of expertise and science-based guidance that you and others like you can offer us. These voices are too often being sidelined. Things are upside down. In you, we have someone who made the right call in the early days and has been removed from your position, while so many people who made the wrong call still have their jobs. Dr. Bright, when the counsel that you and others offer is cast aside, and I know you know this, it means that science and reason are also being cast aside. That's a dangerous impulse. It's an attitude that deprives our country in this critical moment of any real chance of getting ahead of this pandemic. But hopefully we can learn from this. There's still time to put science and reason back into the national strategy for fighting COVID-19. We need people like you to help lead us through this. The federal response has got to get smarter. It has to put science ahead of politics and cronyism and wishful thinking. Our committee will continue to press for that in the days ahead. And I know that you want to look forward. So tell us, what can we do now to learn from the mistakes of January and February and March and make sure that we navigate and lead our country through this public health crisis?
Congressman, we need to install and empower leadership. And we need to unleash the voices of the scientists in our public health system in the United States so they can be heard. And their guidances need to be listened to. And we need to be able to convey that information to the American public so they have the truth about the real risk and dire consequences of this virus. And they have the truth about the consequences of their actions if they don't follow those guidances. And we don't have a single point of leadership right now for this response, and we don't have a master plan for this response. So those two things are absolutely critical. I would also encourage Congress to ensure there is oversight in this response. Large sums of funding have become available to help us as scientists and others respond to this outbreak. And without proper oversight of those dollars, I'm concerned that they could be misdirected and lost and not put to the right fight. So I would urge Congress to continue and increase their oversight in how those funds are being spent and making sure they're prioritized and used appropriately to end this pandemic.
Thanks for that caution. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired and he yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentlewoman from Indiana, Ms. Brooks, for 5 minutes for her questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Dr. Bright, with all due respect, the Vice President was named the head of the Coronavirus White House Task Force, which was actually a recommendation from a bipartisan blue ribbon study panel that issued recommendations years ago and thought the office of the Vice President ought to be in charge of the response. And so, with all due respect, I believe there is that coordination. And part of what I'm very, very concerned relative to this hearing is that there's the impression being made that there's been no plan. And in fact, that's part of what the reauthorization of PAPA that I worked closely with you, Dr. Kadlik, that Congresswoman Eshoo, Dr. Burgess, so many of us relied on you all to share with us what we needed to do to reauthorize PAPA, which most members of Congress really didn't know what that was, Pandemic All Hazard Preparedness Act. Most members of Congress and most members of the American public didn't know we had strategic national stockpiles and that we might actually be short some of these things until this all hit. But we did get that reauthorized, and it was signed into law in June of 19. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And Dr. Bright, you joined BARDA to lead the Influenza Division 2010 right after H1N1 because of your expertise, and we rely on your expertise, and you became director in 2016. After, and you mentioned it in 2007, but after the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, the supply of masks in the Strategic National Stockpile was not resupplied. You've mentioned that actually we've had a problem since 2007. So, but I have to share with you, members like Congresswoman Eshoo and I who've had discussions about this, many of us really didn't know that. We, as members of this committee, did not know and were not told of these shortages of masks as we worked through reauthorization of this important law. Were you aware of this issue, and did you push HHS to maintain mass production for purposes of replenishing the Strategic National Stockpile before this happened in January?
Before 2017, we actually held an annual review of the Strategic National Stockpile that was chaired by Dr. Laurie at the previous ASPR. Since we removed the Strategic National Stockpile from the CDC management under the ASPR management, we have not yet had an interagency cross-departmental review of the supplies in that Strategic National Stockpile. We went through an annual prioritization process. There's always been limited funding and never enough to completely top off the stockpile.
Did you know Greg Burrell?
I do.
He retired.
Yes.
Prior to all of this happening. He led the Strategic National Stockpile.
Yes.
Did you have conversations with Greg Burrell from 2009 until 2020 about what was in the Strategic National Stockpile?
Absolutely. The flu risk management meeting met on a monthly basis, and each year they reviewed and prioritized items that should be purchased by the Strategic National Stockpile.
Okay.
That body, which I actually directed for some time, made recommendations and prioritizations to the Strategic National Stockpile. However, it was the Strategic National Stockpile's responsibility to make those purchases.
And how about FEMC? Does BARDA participate in FEMC? And would you please, very, very briefly, because my time is limited, explain what FEMC is? This is a plan that experts like yourselves participate in. So I want the American people to know there have been plans. There have been plans that FEMC had forth a 2017-18 implementation plan. The White House put forth in September of 2018 a national biodefense plan. Did you participate in that national biodefense plan?
I did, and many of us did.
And it was the first time that our country had actually put forth a national biodefense plan. Many said it was kind of landmark, and same thing with FEMC, putting forth many plans. So I want the American people to know a lot of folks over a long period of time have been focused, but yet we did not still have enough. We didn't have enough swabs, we didn't have enough masks, we don't have enough gowns for all of those incredible healthcare providers. So I don't want everyone to be given the impression that you raised the flag just in January, okay, when you saw it was short, because you hadn't gotten the job done prior to January, and you were at those tables, as were so many others. This happened over a very, very long period of time. And those of us have been very disappointed to learn what was and was not in the Strategic National Stockpile. I thank you for your service. I thank you for your expertise. But across the board, over many administrations, we did not do enough. And I yield back.
Do you want to respond, Doctor?
I could say that those plans have been in place, and it's disappointing they were not pulled out in January of this year and followed. They were not put on the table with a strong leader indicating these are our plans, everyone fall in line and follow through with this plan. I think it's important to emphasize the FEMC is the Public Health Emergency Medical Countermeasure Enterprise, which is comprised of many great scientists from across our government to put these plans in place. But since 2017, we have largely dismantled that FEMC organization. We have not had those interagency discussions for a number of years. The Executive Enterprise Committee and Executive Leadership Committee, we may have had 1 or 2 meetings at most in a new restructured or reorganized FEMC organization. So the partners and colleagues across government haven't had those venues to even talk or coordinate for a number of years to understand what that plan looked like and how they would work together to implement that plan when the day came to need it.
Okay, the gentlewoman's time has expired and she's yielded back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan, for your 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Bright, you've described pressure from senior Trump administration officials to promote the malaria drug chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine to treat COVID-19 despite the lack of scientific support for this treatment. According to your account, when Bayer offered to donate chloroquine pills to the Strategic National Stockpile on March 17, your team of experts at HHS determined that, quote, there are safety liabilities associated with the drug, close quote, and that, quote, accepting the donation could lead to widespread use that is not supported by any clinical data, close quote. Further, one of the public health experts advising you said, quote, no data available to support that chloroquine provides clinical benefit to the treatment or prevention of COVID-19, close quote. Yes or no, Dr. Bright, are there safety liabilities associated with chloroquine?
There are, yes.
According to your whistleblower complaint at the time of the Bayer offer, the consensus from BARDA and FDA scientists was that it was advisable to wait for additional clinical data before making any recommendations on the use of chloroquine to treat COVID-19. Is that correct, yes or no?
That is correct.
Yet on March 19th, the Bayer moved forward and announced the donation of chloroquine, and President Trump told the country at a White House press conference that the drug had, quote, shown very, very encouraging early results, close quote. Yes or no, was the president's statement accurate?
I do not think that was the best informed statement.
In that press conference, the president also said that the drug had, quote, been around for a long time, so we know things don't go as planned. It's not going to kill anybody, close quote. Yes or no, is that statement accurate?
The drug had been around a long time for its use in malaria, but it had not been around for a long time for its use in COVID-19 patients. That's a different indication, different clinical outcome, and the drug can behave differently in those people.
Yes or no, is it true that within days of that press conference, you received urgent instructions from HHS General Counsel passed from the White House directing you to obtain the authorization necessary to make the drugs widely available to the public?
That's true.
Yes or no, did the pressure from the White House and HHS General Counsel put you in a difficult position?
Yes.
And how did you handle this pressure while still trying to protect the American people?
We had to come up with the alternate solution that our administration would accept.
Yes or no, did the administration respect this compromise?
They accepted eventually. The emergency use authorization option was accepted by Dr. Cadillac and the administration, yes.
What I'm aware of, and I would agree with that the HHS Assistant Secretary for Health, Admiral Brett Goyer, on April 4 said this compromise, quote, matters not, close quote, and that the drug needed to go to pharmacies as well as hospitals. Dr. Bright, there are only 24 hours in a day, and every hour you and your team had to spend on chloroquine is an hour you couldn't work on fighting this virus. Yes or no, did the president's obsession with this issue distract you and others on your team from your mission of saving lives?
The directive we received to prioritize and put an expanded access protocol in place within 48 hours was extremely distracting to dozens of federal scientists who were focused on the coronavirus outbreak. They had to set aside all other work to try to put together this protocol in the 48-hour directive time period.
Yes or no, did it distract from efforts to prepare for this crisis, including securing PPE and ramping up testing and the production of other essential supplies?
It distracted from their efforts in developing other vaccines and drugs and that they were focused on at that time. It was a different group of individuals who were focused on procuring PPE.
Dr. Bright, just yesterday, the president questioned the testimony of Dr. Fauci when discussing children and schools. The president insisted that, quote, it has very, very little impact on young people. Dr. Bright, yes or no, do we know that the president's statement is accurate?
There's a lot we don't yet know about this virus, and it's really concerning over the last few weeks that we're getting more and more data out of New York and other places where they've had high numbers of infections of the impact of this virus in children. It's very different presentation and outcome in children that we see in adults, and it's very concerning, and we don't yet have an answer for that, but we should proceed very cautiously and not have any hope or knowledge that we know everything about this virus.
Dr. Bright, I want to end by quoting your testimony, quote, without clear planning and implementation of the steps that I and other experts have outlined, 2020 will be the darkest winter in modern history. The darkest winter in modern history. Yes or no, do you believe this administration is doing everything it can to prevent the darkest winter, and what more should they be doing?
I believe there's a lot of work that we still need to do. And I think we need still, I know, we need still a comprehensive plan, and everyone across the government and everyone in America needs to know what that plan is and what role they play. There are critical steps that we need to do to prepare for that fall, for that winter coming. We do not still have enough personal protective equipment to manage our healthcare workers and protect them from influenza and COVID-19. We still do not have the supply chains ramped up for the drugs and vaccines, and we still don't have plans in place on how we distribute those drugs and vaccines, and we still do not have a comprehensive testing strategy so Americans know which tests do what to do with that information, and we know how to find this virus and trap it and kill it. There's a lot of work we still have to do.
Gentleman yields back. A pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Mullen, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd be remiss not to thank you for your continued prayers for my son. That's very kind of you, and I really appreciate it. Dr. Bright, you're here on your own time as an individual, is that correct?
Yes.
Where are you currently employed?
I'm currently an employee of the Department of Health and Human Services, and I'm in the middle of transition, I guess you would say, between BARDA and the NIH.
So you've accepted the reassigned position to NIH?
Except that this position is under discussion at this point. I have not yet accepted that role.
So are you currently being paid?
I'm currently being paid.
Where are you being paid from, out of BARDA or from NIH?
It's not completely clear to me, but I believe it's out of NIH.
So are you getting a paycheck since you've been over there since mid-April, right? Is that correct?
I've received one paycheck, sir. and
What, from
my
NIH?
understanding, I think it was still part BARDA and part NIH. I've had discussions about my onboarding process at NIH.
Are you, at BARDA, you made $285,000, is that correct?
That's true.
So how much are you currently making at NIH?
I don't think my salary has changed.
It's still the same? So you've been over there for approximately 4 weeks, a month?
It has been about 3 weeks since I was removed from my office at BARDA.
So have you reported to NIH yet?
I've checked in with the NIH director's office, and we've discussed the onboarding process, the fingerprinting process, and we had a call just last evening to discuss a framework of my responsibilities that they have envisioned for me at NIH.
So you haven't actually reported to work, but you're still getting paid, correct?
I've been on sick leave since I was pushed out of my position at BARDA.
Sick leave for what?
For very high blood pressure, and I've been under treatment for my position.
For hypertension?
For hypertension, sir, yes.
So you're on medical leave?
I've been on medical leave. This week, however, I transitioned from that medical leave to annual leave so I can manage this.
What is annual leave? What do you mean?
It's vacation time. So
you're on vacation time right now?
I'm on vacation
Did you
time
inform your supervisors about you coming here today, or did you need to do that?
I have informed them about my leave status, and I've had a conversation with them last night.
So you transferred from medical leave to vacation this week, or does it start next week?
I had a conversation with my physician about my hypertension and how we've been managing it over the last 3 weeks, because this has been very stressful to be removed suddenly without explanation from my role and position. It's a life change for me. And my physician has been working very closely with me to manage my hypertension and stress. And the conversation I had with him last night indicated
I guess I'm kind of confused there, because you say you have hypertension, but yet you were able to do these interviews, you're able to make the report, and you're able to prepare for this hearing, yet you're too sick to go into work, but you're well enough to come here, while you're still getting paid from the United States government. Is that correct?
Sir, I've been under medical leave until
I get that, but if you've been
yesterday.
underneath medical leave, too sick to do that, but yet you can prepare for a 2-hour hearing, I just having a hard time tracking that. I have a hard time understanding that. And if you have hypertension and you're too sick to go to NIH, but you didn't ever experience that in BARDA, right? You never had issues in BARDA with hypertension?
I didn't have the level of stress of being removed from my position while I was in BARDA. So this has been very stressful. And my position.
I get it. People handle pressure. People handle pressure quite different. But as a director of BARDA, I'd feel like you're in quite a bit of stressful position when you're trying to manage a pandemic, but you can't manage that, or you could manage that, but you can't manage your own hypertension when it comes because you got removed from the office. But yet you can still receive pay from NIH, but you can't show up for work. And then all of a sudden you can prepare for this, but you can't do that. I just have a hard time understanding it. I know you're a bright individual and very smart, but you are an employee of the federal government, and I just want to make sure you're not doing something to deceive the American people at the same time getting paid from the United States government. With that, I'm going to yield to our ranking member, Walden.
I thank the gentleman. Dr. Bright, your lawyer appears to have a pretty substantial binder there, and I know Mr. Guthrie asked about the documents that are on the table. Are those the exhibits to your complaint to the Office of Special Counsel?
I don't know what these are.
I'll direct it to the council then, since she's answered other questions. Are those the exhibits to the complaint to the Office of Special Counsel?
Some are, and some are my work product, and some are my notes, and they're not appropriate to turn over to Congress.
So is it appropriate to turn over the documents that are referenced in the complaint, not your work product, I respect that, to this committee? And would you do that?
You asked that question initially, and I said we would look at the documents to determine whether they are appropriate to turn over.
I'm just talking about the ones that we have partial email chains, we have screenshots of emails. I think we should have the right to see those documents if we're going to effectively know the full extent of this complaint. And I just wish you would commit to turn those over. Dr. Bright, will you turn those over?
I think I addressed that.
Dr. Bright, I'm asking Dr. Bright now.
I've
Are you willing to
submitted my
turn
full
over
complaint to the office.
as an individual
Gentleman's
citizen?
time is expired.
Whistleblower, we just want to see what you've submitted so we can evaluate it ourselves.
So I don't understand the full process, other than I was supposed to submit it to the Office of Special Counsel, which I've done so. I don't understand the legalities of sharing that before they've had their opportunity to review that. And
They've certainly been shared out into the public and press.
Public, as well as the complaint. That's what was out there.
I know, but
Now, I haven't
any other
tracked daily who
investigation-
says what. I mean, maybe Politico has something too. I don't know the veracity of things.
But in
like
any other, any other investigation, we'd both be going, say, we need to see all the documents as a committee. So that's all I'm after.
Madam Chairwoman,
Just the
may I
facts.
address one point?
No, I think we need to move on. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized, Mr. Schrader.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, Dr. Bright. Really appreciate it. Tough to do. Very impressive that you're here. Could you describe the tone and reactions of Dr. Kadek and Dr. Azar at your January 23rd meeting when they had the all agencies meeting on the COVID virus? Could you describe how up to speed they seem to be?
in that meeting, sir, it was one of our first meetings that we had about how to address the outbreak. And because we had practiced, I came in with my list of needs, and those lists for money, people, and viruses. My request was met with a bit of surprise and puzzlement. I remember Secretary Azar looking around the room and saying, money, you need money, maybe there's money somewhere. I mean, it was just something that I could tell.
Despite the fact that we had the outbreak in China for some time.
This was January 23rd at this point.
Could you describe January 25th, if you remember, email exchange with Mr. Bowen on the mask situation?
I don't remember that specific, but I'm sure it was urgent. I'm sure that Mr. Bowen was sending me a notice saying, asking if this.
So you didn't ask him to come and talk to you. He just reached out to you.
Yes, sir.
Okay. How about an email exchange with Dr. Kerr on January 27th? Did you reach out to Dr. Kerr? Did he come and wanted to?
Dr. Kerr reached out to me, I believe. This was because, again, he is a pandemic influenza expert as well, response, and he knows the vital nature of needing those viruses, and he was involved in prepping our secretary for a call he had with the Vice Minister Ma in China. And we knew a high priority was for our secretary to ask for those viruses. We've had challenges in the past in getting viruses from China from avian influenza strains and viruses. So this was a high priority. We needed that to get started. And he was alarmed when he wrote to me that morning indicating that the CDC director had reprioritized and actually indicated we did not need, or he did not need to, the secretary did not need to ask China for viruses. And it was alarming to us because we knew how critical it was.
Now that sounds incredible in light of what has transpired since then. So I guess my major point here is that we have a brave individual coming forward as a whistleblower, but he is not alone. There are many other experts, scientists, and manufacturers that realized we were in, if I may say, deep shit not a long time ago, long before the administration and the White House began to wake up. What do you think would have happened if Mr. Navarro had not reached out to you and actually responded to you? Where would we be now if you hadn't been able at least to get one person in the White House's attention?
It's difficult to speculate where we were. So even when Mr. Navarro reached out and strongly suggested action be taken on February 10th, February 9th is in the email, February 10th, it was conveyed to Dr. Kadlec that we needed to ramp up production of N95 masks. That order did not go out, that solicitation did not close till March 18th. So even with the pressure of Mr. Navarro, who I believe shared a sense of urgency about this outbreak, that pressure alone still did not spur Dr. Kadlec and our strategic national stockpile into that urgently needed action.
Well, that's very disconcerting, and the reason we're here today, perhaps. Last question, if I may, and switching gears and going to the other side of the spectrum, while it's been hard to get folks' attention here in Washington, D.C. and the administration on the seriousness of this, I think most people now are convinced this is a very serious issue. And I'm a little concerned we're going too much the other way in terms of information. You alluded to it here on the vaccines. I think some people are under the impression there's a vaccine going to be developed in a couple of months and everything's going to be fine, I can go back to work. And we unfortunately have to juxtapose economic issues. They have to have realistic expectations at home. And you, I think, accurately indicated, well, it can take up to 10 years. And, the quickest we did, I guess, was Ebola, and that was, I believe, 5 years. So, is it tough question to ask? I suppose you don't have to answer. But I mean, I don't want America to think they can just not get back to some semblance of a new post-COVID life until a vaccine comes out, because that could take years. And there's a chance the vaccine will maybe not be as effective, much like our flu vaccines that, with the flu mutating year to year sometimes. So I just want to make sure that ask you if you would agree that we can't wait to open up America entirely until a vaccine is there. We have to use some of the other parameters you've already suggested.
We have to make sure that we have some scientifically led and driven decisions on how and when it's safe to reopen America. If it happens before we have a vaccine, if we have a vaccine faster, that's great, but if we do need to open America up sooner, we need to make sure everyone understands the risk and understands the risk of their activities, and everyone has to play a critical part in following those activities to reduce the risk. We have to have a testing plan in place and enough tests to make sure that we know when people are exposed so they can be quarantined and isolated and not continue to infect others. And we also are developing a number of therapeutics that could offer some potential benefit prophylactically or protect you almost like a vaccine before you're infected. And those are being developed and maybe even faster than a vaccine. And if healthcare workers and frontline workers can use those therapeutics, then that might offer them some protection as well until there is a vaccine. So there's a number of steps in between now and a vaccine. I believe if we let science lead the discussion and we inform America of the risk and the clear guidance on what needs to happen and people follow that guidance, then there is a stepwise process to getting back to work and back out of our homes.
Great,
Gentleman's
thank you very
time
much.
has expired. And he yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, let me say I believe any whistleblower should be respected and allowed to be heard. That's a core component of keeping our government accountable and running smoothly. But this hearing is not about a whistleblower complaint. It's about undermining the administration during a national and global crisis. That's evidenced by the fact this hearing is being held in the wrong subcommittee and well before the Office of Special Counsel finishes its work. To disregard the minority so spectacularly in the organization of this hearing only highlights the partisan and political nature of this hearing. I hope today will be held up in the future as a lesson of what not to do and the respect and gravity that should be given to whistleblower complaints so that they're not abused for political expediency. More importantly, though, we have vital work we should be doing. My constituents want Congress to get back to work. So I'm glad to be here to highlight the important work that needs to be done. I heard from an ophthalmologist in my district this week about the need for relief. She says she'll consider this year a success if her practice group even breaks even. Long story short, we should be examining the $175 billion authorized and appropriated in a bipartisan manner for providers and what providers still need and recommendations for moving forward. We should also be examining why there are gaps in outcomes and access for minority communities. Fayetteville, North Carolina, in my district, has a large and diverse community, and understandably, the folks back home are scared because coronavirus hits them hardest. Why are we not spending our time today examining this crisis within a crisis more closely? I hear from providers and hospitals about issues with PPE. I know this administration has done extraordinary things to secure more PPE. I want to thank President Donald Trump for his strong leadership. Not only did his administration move quickly to coordinate a response, but his travel ban on January 30th was a bold move, though it was panned by his critics as an overreaction at the time. The administration has gone to great lengths to overcome an inadequate system they inherited. And as you testified earlier, moved quickly to start programs like Project Airbridge to expedite more PPE coming in. But questions remain about why there is a global shortage and what more Congress can do to support the administration's efforts to secure sufficient PPE. This committee should be working on that question. We have multiple pieces of bipartisan legislation waiting to be considered to improve the operations of the Strategic National Stockpile. We should be examining why our stockpile was allowed to dwindle under previous administrations. The answers to these questions and solutions to these problems are timely and critical to helping this administration combat this virus and the deadly disease it causes. I hear from constituents every day who are suffering under these stay-at-home orders. This crisis is hard for anyone who, even if they weren't suffering from substance use disorder or mental health challenges before they were confined to our homes. And this crisis has exacerbated this problem. Why are we not examining access issues to mental health providers and the effects this crisis has had on our constituents' mental health? Dr. Bright, you're no doubt an accomplished scientist, and I appreciate the service you've rendered this country. You deserve to be heard, and your whistleblower complaint should be given the serious consideration any whistleblower complaint deserves. But we also deserve to have the opportunity to ask questions about serious allegations that have been made against you. And I'll note again, this is not the time or place for that hearing. The time is after the Office of Special Counsel has completed its work, and the place is the Oversight and Investigations Committee. But Dr. Bright, building on questions from Mr. Walden and others, Politico released an article yesterday stating that your complaint left out a lot of information and context regarding agency decisions to acquire hydroxychloroquine. You chose not to elevate your concerns to the Office of Inspector General, but instead kept selected screenshots that didn't include full context. Another example, the Wall Street Journal reported on an email today that seems to show that you were in support of acquiring and using hydroxychloroquine. Can you elaborate on what was missing from your screenshots and why you didn't elevate your concerns at any time to the Office of Inspector General?
So the early days of when I was aware of the hydroxychloroquine, we were interested in acquiring that drug for its use in a randomized controlled clinical study. Actually, when I heard from Dr. Woodcock that it's something that we should try to investigate in a randomized controlled study, I even reached out to a company that was licensed and approved to make that drug in the United States to see if they could donate that drug to the NIH to conduct those clinical studies. I was aware of other efforts that were ongoing to try to acquire some of that drug for its use in randomized controlled clinical studies. As long as it was going to be used at that time for those randomized controlled clinical studies, I thought we should look into the supply chain the same way I did with remdesivir. It was only after I learned that that supply that was being discussed was coming in from Pakistan and from India, from facilities that were not approved by the FDA, and the drug was not approved for use in the United States, that I became increasingly alarmed of having that drug in the United States. Second, it was when I learned that the plan was to make that drug available through an expanded access program so people could potentially get that drug and not be under the close supervision of a healthcare provider. That caused significant concern. It's because of that and the cascading days afterwards that we put in that emergency use authorization with the safety bumpers and barriers that we could feel comfortable with, that drug would only be used under close clinical supervision. But in the earlier days, in that email exchange that you're referring to, was before we knew about this information in Pakistan, before we knew it was going to be used for expanded access protocol. It was when I thought our efforts to obtain some of that drug would be used at the NIH to conduct randomized controlled clinical studies. So I was relieved that we did identify some supplies of that drug for those clinical studies.
Jim, my time's expired, Madam Chair. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Kennedy, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Dr. Bright, thank you very much for being here, and thank you for your service to our country. Let's ground this hearing a little bit. As of this morning, which means these numbers have increased, there's nearly 1.4 million cases diagnosed of COVID-19 in the United States and over 80,000 fatalities. Experts believe both of those numbers are an undercount because after 5 months of this virus being on our shores, we still have a systemic problem with regards to robust testing. Is that right? Cases in many states across the country are still actually increasing in number despite that lack of testing. Is that right? You've mentioned in your testimony that, quote, we missed early warning signs and forgot important pages from our pandemic playbook. Is that right?
Yes.
Sir, you've been the head of BARDA since 2016. Is that right?
Yes.
Until recently. Have you experienced any pandemics prior to this one over your course of time, either there or in your prior government service?
We responded to the Zika outbreak. We responded to the Ebola outbreak. They didn't rise to the level of pandemic.
Of course not.
But yes.
Right. Thank you for the clarification. Sir, you're aware at the end of the Obama administration, the Obama team put together a playbook to try to guide succeeding administrations on how to handle an outbreak, correct?
Yes.
Sir, you're also aware that there's a simulation done from an outgoing Obama administration in January 2017 with an incoming administration about how to respond to a pandemic. Is that right?
Yes.
And you're aware that the Trump administration cut the number of CDC staff located in China from 47 to 14. Is that right?
I don't know the exact number. I know it was reduced.
Okay. And sir, you referenced already the simulation called Crimson Contagion. That was a simulation done by HHS and begun in January of 2019. Can you shed just very briefly a little bit of light as to what the findings of Crimson Contagion were?
The significant findings, it was actually, participants were beyond HHS, it covered broad areas of government and federal and state and locals. Some of the significant findings were the need for improved coordination and communication and alignment between the federal and state and local tribal territorial governments, and the significant need for personal protective equipment and the shortage, and a significant need for funding initially.
And sir, that simulation was based off of a flu-like virus that was initially detected in China, spread by global air travel, and resulted in the infection of 110 million Americans, leading to 7.7 million hospitalized and nearly 600,000 dead. Is that right?
Yes.
Sir, when did you first have concerns about the potential impact of COVID-19 on the United States?
In early January.
And were you aware that your supervisor, Dr. Cadlick, suggested that the activation of the Defense Production Act in mid-January?
I wasn't aware of him doing that, no.
Okay, well, you mentioned that you had 2 meetings with Secretary Azar. I'm sure you had others, but you referenced so far in your testimony meetings on January 23rd and 27th, where you raised concerns directly to the Secretary. Is that right?
Yes.
And
the Secretary was not at the second meeting. Deputy Secretary Hargan was there.
Thank you. You're aware that top National Security Council staff, including National Security Advisor Mr. O'Brien and his deputy Matthew Pottinger, raised significant warnings that China was downplaying the impacts of this virus.
I did learn of that in the meeting at the White House, yes.
You're aware that we sent 17.8 tons of medical supplies to China in early February.
I've learned of that.
Are you aware that the Trump administration budget proposal released in February of 2020 called for a cut to CDC by nearly $700 million?
I'm not aware of that. I've heard of it.
Are you familiar with a memo written by Peter Navarro that warned of the impact of the virus?
Yes.
Are you aware that it was spread among senior administration and White House officials?
Yes.
Are you aware that it was on or about April 2nd when the Trump administration finally activated and expanded the Defense Production Act, months after being warned by you and other senior administration officials?
I've learned of that.
Are you aware that that order itself did not extend to the full authority of the DPA and left a haphazard allocation process to states and hospitals to compete against each other?
I don't know the details of that authority, sir.
Has the coronavirus task force actually developed a plan for reopening the country?
I'm not aware of the full plan to reopen, sir.
Have they developed some principles that the White House has touted as some principles or guidelines as to how to reopen the country?
I've heard of some principles.
Are states following that plan?
It doesn't appear that there is a nationwide coordinated plan that states are following, sir.
So after this recitation of the actions and inactions of this administration over the course of the past 6 months or so, can we possibly say that this administration has prepared our country for the moment that we are in, and how we could possibly be prepared for the distribution, development, manufacturing, and distribution of a vaccine to try to address 330 million Americans over the course of the months ahead?
I think we have a lot of work to do to be prepared, sir. I don't think we're fully prepared.
Thank you, sir. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Long, for his 5 minutes of questions. Okay.
We can go to Curtis.
Should we go to? You want to pass?
I think we're going to reserve, yeah.
Okay, you can reserve, and we'll go to the gentleman from California, Mr. Cardenas, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Bright, for being here today, and I just want to tell you that my family, my community, and myself, we appreciate your 25 years of focused service, specifically when it comes to addressing pandemic outbreaks. And it's my understanding that you've spent those 25 years leading teams of scientists when it comes to drugs, diagnostics, and vaccine development. And we appreciate that. When an administration or decision makers prioritize politics over science, does that tend to increase or decrease the likely results of the loss of life in the middle of a pandemic?
I believe the scientists are best equipped to understand how to manage a public health crisis, and I believe scientists should lead.
And therefore, to my question again, I'll phrase it differently. If the scientists are not leading and the politicians are leading with the final decisions when trying to address the issues of pandemics that are taking people's lives, that way of handling it, does that likely increase the loss of life, or is it likely to decrease the loss of life?
I believe the scientists leading will actually increase the likelihood that we can survive this pandemic and move through it. So if scientists are not allowed to lead and speak up, I believe it could increase the loss of lives.
Thank you. How many times in your career have you personally actively said, I need to enact my right to be a whistleblower?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
How many times in the last 25 years have you decided to enact your right to be a whistleblower?
This is my first time, sir.
Okay, I knew that answer was simple, and I think I confused you because I made it so simple. And the reason why I want to say that is because I believe that you've been incredibly consistent in your willingness to dedicate yourself, your expertise, and your career to saving lives. Is the loss of life on your mind? Was that on your mind when you decided that you needed to enact your right to be a whistleblower?
I've spent my career focused on saving lives, and sir, everything I've done to come forward now is to raise awareness of challenges we have, things that are not getting done, because I do think it will save more lives.
Okay. Are you aware of the fact that the lack of testing in the United States of America is affected by many pieces of the puzzle in order for people to get testing, whether it's swabs, whether it's N95 rated equipment for the caregivers to be able to enact safely with the public? Are those all factors that have contributed to our lack of having adequate testing in America?
They are factors, sir. I don't think anyone has thought through the entire plan completely to understand those critical components for testing. I think there's a lot of confusion about the different types of tests, and I think our national narrative is focused on a number of tests, and it's not about the number so much as the right types of tests, and the Americans know how to use them and what they do with that information. And no one has really thought through the raw material supply chain to make sure we can sustain the need to test.
Okay, that sounds a little confusing from somebody who actually has been working at a high level of the United States government in this space that we're discussing at this moment. So my question is, if we are not implementing in this pandemic to the degree or ability that the United States should or could, what's contributed the most to that? Was it the lack of scientists recommending up the chain of command, or was it the people at the top of the chain of command deciding to do things differently than the scientists are strongly recommending?
There's evidence of scientists raising concerns about shortages and other actions that are important to take that were not being taken. Is a different level. In my personal situation as the leadership at HHS, and I asked for Dr. Cadlick, that I believe was dismissive of the early warnings that I was raising.
Okay, and you said early warnings, and despite the early warnings, have there been other examples where warnings and strong recommendations were either being ignored or set aside and other actions were taken?
So I believe that I've learned of others. I mean, the CDC's written several guidelines for reopening America and getting people out of their homes and back to work, and I'm not sure if all of those guidelines have been reviewed or being publicly considered at this point. So there's another example of, I think, really hardworking career scientists and their information and their hard work not probably getting the proper vetting and proper exposure to the American public.
Well, one of the things, I have no idea how much time I have because the clock's been flipping back and forth, but hopefully I have a little bit of time. We've heard boasting from the White House about millions of personal protective equipment, PPEs, as everybody knows them as. Millions have gone out to America. But fact, to date, we should have had billions gone out throughout America. Isn't that the disparity?
There's a huge disparity, and healthcare workers are having to compromise their protection and their health and safety because they're having to be creative and reuse a single mask for the entire week or come up with novel sterilization practices that are not proven or tested yet. So that disparity actually is impacting our frontline workers, and those are the people whose lives we really need to preserve so they can treat others.
I have family members who are working in hospitals today on the front lines who have been telling me that they are wearing equipment for days at a time that they're supposed to be disposing of several times a day.
Gentleman's
and they're
time
having to use them over and over.
Expired.
So thank you very much, Madam Chair. And if somebody could do a better job of the clock,
Yes.
I'd appreciate it. It kept flipping back and forth. I was trying to...
You're absolutely right. It got stuck at 4:44, went to 0, and popped up to 1:21. So I'm watching too. My father was a watchmaker, clock repairman. Where is Daddy when we need him? A pleasure to recognize Mr. Long from Missouri for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And Dr. Bright, you contend that your removal was because the Trump administration and HHH leadership in particular lacked scientific integrity. Do you think that Dr. Fauci lacks scientific integrity?
Sir, I don't think my removal has anything associated with Dr. Fauci at all. I think my removal was because of tensions and actions I took between my supervisor, Dr. Cadlick, and myself.
Do you know about Dr. Fauci's testimony 2 days before at the Senate Health Committee?
I'm aware of that testimony, yes.
If HHH leadership is so hostile to scientific integrity, as you say, as you allege, how do you explain Dr. Fauci being allowed to testify forthrightly, to serve in a prominent role on the White House task force, the administration, and direct NIAID's extensive research efforts?
So I'm not sure what decisions are involved in allowing Dr. Fauci to testify or not. That's not something.
Can you say that again?
I'm not sure. I'm not aware of what process or decisions are involved in allowing Dr. Fauci to testify or not.
But he was allowed to testify.
I know he was, but I thought I understood you to ask me if that was appropriate or if he was not being allowed to. Maybe you can repeat your question if I misunderstood it.
Okay, what I'm saying is you're saying HHS is hostile to scientific integrity. And if that's the case, can you explain why Dr. Fauci was allowed to testify forthrightly in the committee? If they're hostile to, why would you let him come out and testify without no hold barred?
I'm saying that my supervisor was not following proper scientific process that we have in place for BARDA. I'm not actually saying the administration is hostile against scientific integrity in all cases. So I'm saying in my particular situation, as in my claim, my supervisor was conducting an inappropriate activity that was going around proper scientific vetting. That is what I put in my claim.
Why did you not bring these concerns to Secretary Azar or his chief or the Inspector General? Why did you not bring any of them into the loop and say, hey, I have these concerns?
Sir, I believe some of the activities were not isolated with Dr. Cadlick. I think some of his senior staff was also aware of some of the processes that were being utilized to go around our traditional review process, scientific review process.
But wouldn't normal protocol in any situation be that you go to the Secretary of HHS or his Chief of Staff or the Inspector General with your concerns instead of just gathering them up and deciding that one day you're gonna?
Well, I didn't decide that. I was pushed out, sir, and involuntarily transfer without my
But
knowledge.
you had these concerns, so why didn't you take them to your superiors when you had the concerns? And maybe none of this, maybe we wouldn't be here today. It wasn't easy for any of us to get here today.
Sir, I requested an IG investigation, as is my claim. I think it was in 2018, that they look into what I believe was inappropriate pressure, political pressure on some of our contracting activities in discussion about procurement integrity. And I do not think that that was ever followed.
when it was needed. Was that done here?
No, sir.
In fact, we had governors and hospitals competing with each other to try to get desperately needed equipment. Isn't that correct?
There's a lot of confusion, a lot of competition, and bad decisions made to acquire poor quality product.
Right. In any of those other countries that I just mentioned, are you aware of the leader of that country at a press conference making recommendations on what kind of medication people should use?
I don't know the details of what happened in those countries, sir, so I don't know.
All right. You know, we had governors here, Republicans and Democrats, Republicans like Hogan, like Phil Scott from Vermont, who have done a tremendous job. But no matter how good they do their job, can they protect their people without the aggressive intervention of the federal government playing its role?
I think the federal government plays a critical role in coordinating and aligning and making an equitable distribution of those critical supplies. I believe that's what we'd practice and exercise in the past, that there would be a critical role for the federal lead in coordination at the state, local, and tribal and territorial levels.
Thank you, Dr. Bright. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter. Do you wish to question, or do you want to pass? You reserve, okay. The gentleman from California, Mr. Ruiz, is recognized for 5 minutes of questions. Dr. Ruiz.
Thank you, Dr. Bright. Thank you for your testimony here, and thank you for your service to our country. My heart aches for the family and friends of the over 80,000 in America who have died of COVID-19 in such a short period of time. In fact, my heart aches for those closer to me. The Riverside County has reported 228 deaths. As a doctor, I appreciate your written testimony that states that science, not politics or cronyism, must lead the way to combat this deadly virus. There's been a lot of hype about cures for COVID that have been shown to be ineffective and even dangerous. We are now seeing the very real dangers and consequences of not making decisions based on science. Hydroxychloroquine, which Fox News commentators and then the White House repeatedly touted and actually encouraged people to use, is Exhibit A on this list. But there is one drug that appears to provide some therapeutic benefit, remdesivir. 2 weeks ago, Dr. Fauci announced that remdesivir showed a clear-cut, significant positive effect in diminishing the time to recovery. My understanding is that in January and early February, you launched a comprehensive review to assess which existing drugs might prove a therapeutic benefit, and you quickly identified remdesivir as the most likely drug to be effective against COVID-19. Can you describe how you came to that conclusion, who you told within HHS, and what the response was?
Yes, sir. That conclusion came about by a technical review from a number of scientists within HHS, so the CDC, FDA, NIH, and BARDA. But it was also aligned with a scientific assessment from WHO and a number of global experts who rapidly looked at every potential drug and ranked remdesivir as the drug that had the most potential for benefit.
Who did you tell, and what was the response?
We shared that information with Dr. Kadlik. We shared that information within HHS leadership as well. We had discussions about the actions that could be considered for acquiring the limited supply of remdesivir.
So what was the response?
And we had discussions about how to ramp up production of more remdesivir in case the randomized controlled clinical study that the NIH was conducting came through with positive.
And so you had a discussion, and what was the response? Did anything happen?
No decision was made at that time.
My understanding is that Peter Navarro, the White House trade advisor, reached out to you on February 7th to seek your counsel. You told him about your top 3 concerns: the shortage of N95 masks, the need for a quote-unquote Manhattan Project to develop vaccines, and securing adequate supplies of remdesivir. Can you tell us if Mr. Navarro agreed with you and what steps you and he took?
Mr. Navarro did agree with me on the remdesivir, the N95 mask, and the Vaccine Manhattan Project, and he drafted a memo on February 9th to the White House Chief of Staff and Mick Mulvaney to share with the White House Task Force.
The directive for HHS to act on remdesivir occurred on February 10th. What happened next? And did the department promptly procure the needed supplies of remdesivir?
We did not proceed with procuring any supplies of remdesivir.
Okay. You were removed from your position on April 22nd. By the time you were removed, had the department settled on a plan and procured the remdesivir?
No, sir, they were still discussing slide presentations about potential donations of remdesivir at that time.
So what you are describing is a gang that couldn't shoot straight, and yet we are in the middle of a pandemic. There is one drug the experts say could make a difference, and in fact has been shown to make a difference, yet the department can't seem to figure out how to acquire it. A week ago, the Washington Post published an article on the rollout of remdesivir, describing it as, quote, confusing, unfair, and marred with incomplete medical information, unquote. Doctors described how they can't obtain the drug and don't understand the process for accessing it. Dr. Benjamin Linas from the Boston Medical Center said, quote, there's no transparency. The process is just a staggering injustice. Dr. Bright, you were warning about this over 3 months ago. If the department had listened to you and the other experts at your agency, could this fiasco have been avoided?
We would have had a plan, sir. We should have had a plan for that drug and any other drug in limited supply.
So it didn't have to be this way.
Right.
Here's what I don't understand. You were right about the dangers of hydroxychloroquine. You were right about the benefits of remdesivir. You were right about N95 masks and other critical issues. Yet you got fired from your job while officials who botched the response and ignored your warnings stay in theirs. Not only is this unfair to you, it's completely dangerous to the American people. I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. I'd like to clarify something just very quickly relative to your leave, Dr. Bright. Are you on accrued vacation time now?
I'm sorry.
Are you on accrued vacation time now?
I'm on approved vacation leave today, yes. I talked to that.
And would you be willing to share the exhibits once you remove personally identifiable information?
I'm having trouble understanding you through the mask.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I'm getting so comfortable wearing a mask, I forgot I had it on. Would you be willing to share the other exhibits once you remove personally identifiable information?
Yes.
Thank you. All right.
Chairwoman, we will make them available after the hearing today when we've had a chance to review it.
Thank you.
Oh, Madam Chair, will they be made available to the minority as well as the majority?
Be made available to the entire committee.
Perfect.
We've never shared anything with the majority that hasn't been shared. This is a bipartisan issue.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, if there's anything in those exhibits that hasn't already been released to the public that might be degrading, will that be kept in confidence amongst committee members?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Not knowing what's in the emails, I'm wondering if there's any information in there that might be deemed to be degrading, would that be kept in confidence amongst the committee members as opposed to being released to the public?
We'll follow the rules.
And that is in compliance with Rule 11. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay. I now have the pleasure of recognizing the only pharmacist in the United States Congress, Mr. Carter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. Bright, for being here, and thank you for your service to our country. And before I begin, let me extend my condolences to those 80,000 plus who have lost their lives and to their families as a result of this pandemic, and a shout out to all of our healthcare professionals, as well as our other essential workers who have put their own health in danger in order to provide services to our citizens. Dr. Bright, it's my understanding that in 2017, BARDA funded a project with Applied Research Associates of Albuquerque to develop respirators that could be sanitized and reused during public health emergencies such as what we're going through today. However, according to recent reports by the Washington Post, none of these next-generation respirators are available for us today. Why is that? Do you have any idea?
I'm not aware of that. So you're talking about the ventilators, sir, that we developed? Or?
That's correct. I'm talking about those that were developed, the respirators that were developed and could be sanitized and reused during public health emergencies. It's my understanding that that was contracted and that that project was scrapped.
Sir, I'm not familiar with that project, resanitize the respirators.
You're not familiar with that project, and you didn't sign off on that project to your knowledge?
I'm not familiar with that project, resanitize respirators.
Okay, fair enough if you're not familiar with it. Let me ask you this. We've had a lot of discussion today about hydroxychloroquine, about chloroquine, and I'm a little bit confused here because it's my understanding that this is what BARDA, do you want to clarify something here? I see you. Okay. It's my understanding that that's what the role of BARDA, the mission of BARDA is to look at things like this. In fact, when we in Congress allocate money to go toward this, that you are supposed to be looking, that BARDA is supposed to be looking at things that could possibly have merit, such as hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine. And early on, it appeared that you embraced that. And early on, it seemed that you were in favor of looking at that. And I'm just wondering, because of this pandemic, because we didn't have any vaccine or any kind of agreed upon treatment, we should be testing, and that's what we are appropriating that money for. Would you agree with that? That that's what we are trying to do, is to look at what could possibly work and work with public companies to try to encourage them to come up with those kind of solutions?
Absolutely. We should look at all options and make sure we evaluate the potential risk and safety and benefit of those in the context of a randomized controlled clinical study. In the context of emergency, we should move swiftly and get that clinical data as urgently and quickly as possible, but we should not proceed recklessly without that clinical data on its potential adverse events in an emergency.
So you're referring, when you say we should not proceed adversely, you're referring to hydroxychloroquine and the chloroquine?
We were promoting the standing up of randomized controlled clinical studies at the NIH with hydroxychloroquine. I worked with a company to even ask if they would donate drug to the NIH to be used in the context of a randomized controlled clinical study.
Right.
Yes, so that is what BARDA would do.
And in fact, I think you worked with the FDA to get an emergency use for hydroxychloroquine. Is that correct? And it was actually approved by the FDA.
That was in the context of the directive we received from the Secretary's office to stand up an expanded access protocol. Our clinicians.
So are you saying you were instructed to do that and you did it against your will, or?
So we were instructed to put in place an expanded access protocol. So in the context that Americans would be able to access this drug and not be under the close supervision of a physician. The scientists at FDA, NIH, CDC, and BARDA worked together to change that directive to the context of emergency use authorization with guardrails in there so patients would be under the close supervision of a physician.
Understood. Let me ask you this. Initially, you appeared to be encouraged by what could possibly be a result of the effect of hydroxychloroquine. When did that change? When did you sour, if you will, on the use of hydroxychloroquine?
I believe that we've seen many drugs that could have benefit, and some of these are really interesting things we'd never heard of, some we have.
I understand that, but my question was, when did you sour on it?
When it was determined that this drug should be made available to Americans outside the context of a close physician supervision. So I supported conducting a randomized controlled clinical study for hydroxychloroquine at the NIH. When I learned that there is a directive to make it more broadly available, not under close supervision of a physician, I was...
When was that? When did that directive go out?
That was March 23rd.
March 20, and that's the time that you decided, no, this is not what we should do, and we should not be looking at hydroxychloroquine at all.
I didn't think that was the proper, safe way to evaluate that drug in the context of this outbreak. I believe that should be only done under close supervision of a physician. When we put the EUA in place that locked this drug down to only be used in patients under close supervision of a physician, we were satisfied we had those guardrails in place. When an email string followed a week later saying, ignore the EUA, push this drug into the retail pharmacies in New York and New Jersey, that's when I became more concerned.
And who put that directive out?
The gentleman's time has expired.
Who put that directive out?
The gentleman's time has expired. You can answer, Dr. Bright.
Which directive, sir?
That it should be put out to the public without physicians approving it.
That directive was an email string that had a number of individuals on it, and I believe it first came from Dr. Giroir, the Assistant Secretary of Health. It indicated the White House was asking for that drug to be more broadly.
So was it because the president was encouraged by the use of this drug that you became discouraged by it?
It had nothing to do with politics, sir. I wanted to make sure that Americans were aware of the risk of this drug. It was only available under very safe.
But it is a drug that is indicated and has been used safely in the past.
By almost 1.5 minutes. You can finish your answer, Dr. Bright, and then we're going to move to the next member.
The drug had been used safely for malaria for a number of years. We didn't have a database or.
But it's being used in the same dosage as it was used for malaria.
Please. And I know that I'm overly generous with both sides of the aisle, but I think that we need to move on. I mean, 2 minutes of extra time is 2 minutes of extra time, and I'm not going to ask that it be shared over here. The gentleman's time has expired. It's a pleasure to recognize the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Dingle, for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks you to both you and Ranking Member Dr. Burgess and Dr. Bright for your being here today. You're doing a great service. I think we're here today because COVID is real. I share the sentiments of many of my Republican colleagues that have expressed the thanks to the frontline workers asking questions. I want to look at the last few months. COVID's really real in my state. Michigan's the 10th largest state in the country, and we were third in the number of cases for weeks. We were third and remained there until this week in the number of deaths. We managed to move to 4th place 2 days ago, which is not a number anybody wants to be. My family alone, a cousin woke up with 104 temperature and was dead that afternoon. There are people still dying every single day. I have lost someone I've known. Sunday, Monday, a brother-like friend to me, Tuesday and Wednesday. And then we hear the scientific experts, yourself, but Dr. Fauci, other scientists around the country saying to us, if we don't listen to them, we could begin to see, well, we're going to see a return. You call it a dark winter. I call it, I don't want to see any more spikes. I don't want to see anybody else die. I am losing too many friends that I know, and people across the country are. So I want to focus on an area that's not your area of expertise, but it's mine, car safety. We expect our cars to be safe, and we expect car manufacturers to be responsible in making sure defective cars aren't sold. And if they fail in that responsibility, we hold them accountable. If an engineer in a car company realized a model had serious defects and warned her management about that, we would all think she had done her job responsibly. And if management ignored her and our committee found out, I will bet you right now we would be having hearings. And if Americans died driving those cars, the companies would be sued and they would be charged with criminal negligence. In fact, several years ago, before my time, this committee investigated airbag defects and vehicle safety. At the time, this subcommittee's ranking member, Dr. Burgess, said, there is no room for going slow when it comes to safety. And certainly, deception cannot and will not be tolerated. Dr. Burgess was right then, and our car makers have to be accountable. But what I'm concerned about is that we aren't applying these same standards to coronavirus. And I want to learn from what's happened so we keep that dark winter you're talking about from happening. It seems to me, Dr. Bright, you acted the same way the auto engineer I mentioned should act. You identified serious problems and then suggested fixes when it came to diagnostics, N95 masks, other equipment, and medicines. Is that right?
That's true. And Congressman, we still have those challenges.
Do you believe if your suggestions were implemented, lives would have been saved and the severity of the pandemic might have been lessened?
I believe lives would have been saved if we had proper medical protective equipment for our healthcare workers. Yes.
So people died because you weren't listened to?
People died because they didn't have appropriate protective equipment to save their lives and protect them from getting infected.
The problems aren't limited to just ignoring your advice. The American people are confused, given mixed signals, and quite frankly, some days just simply deceived. Let me give you an example. There was a visit to the CDC on March 6th, and at that visit, the administration said, anybody who wants a test will get a test. Was that true then?
There still are not enough tests.
So even this week, as we're being told, anybody who wants a test can have a test. Is that true in the United States of America?
No.
In fact, all the experts say we are doing is only a small fraction of the tests we need to do to reopen safely. I'm running out of time, so let me ask you about vaccines. We keep being told by the White House that we've heard very soon, quick numbers, a matter of months for that vaccine to be developed. This is your area of expertise. You are a top immunologist in the world. Was there any scientific basis to suggest in March that we'll have a vaccine in the next few months?
There's a lot of optimism. There's a lot of hope, but that doesn't make a vaccine. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to make a vaccine.
Will we be able to vaccinate people in the next few months?
It's very unlikely.
Thank you, Doctor.
Gentlewoman yields back. It's my understanding the minority is passing, reserving. With pleasure, I recognize the gentlewoman from New Hampshire, Ms. Custer.
Today, I want to thank you for your courage, for helping us to do our job to protect the American people. I want to start today by restating what I said at a hearing February 26th with Secretary Azar, right here, right at that table. The key to a public health crisis is trust and credibility. On that day, I urged Secretary Azar to provide clear, credible updates from this administration to the American public. However, your whistleblower complaint and testimony today unveil unheeded warnings about personal protective equipment, testing supplies, and vaccine supplies. Over the past several months, I have held countless conversations with doctors and nurses and hospitals and community health centers and our Republican governor and every other person in New Hampshire trying to get access to personal protective equipment, to protect our frontline workers, to protect our grocery clerks. We've been trying to get testing supplies, and we were told that because we were not a hotspot, we were on our own. And we literally had to turn to entrepreneurs, thank God they exist, and thank you to them for flying to China and bringing us the equipment we need that should and could have been distributed had we planned ahead. These conversations have informed my roadmap to recovery on how to safely reopen our economy. And key to those efforts is adequate testing, contact tracing, supported isolation, and vaccine development, your specialty. So I want to focus on your role as Director of BARDA in vaccine development and distribution. On page 28 and 29 of your addendum to your complaint, it states that BARDA estimated that between 650 million and 850 million needles and syringes would be needed for a vaccine to be administered here in the United States, for everyone to be safe. Your team at BARDA also estimates it could take up to 2 years to manufacture these vaccine delivery supplies. To your knowledge, Dr. Bright, at this time, has the administration placed any orders to prepare for how a vaccine will be delivered when one becomes available to every American?
I learned that they placed an order, the first order for needles and syringes on May 1st, and another order is placed today.
And were the amounts adequate?
I believe that it's for 320 million needles and syringes.
And could you please describe the situation if every American does not have access to the vaccine due to a supply shortage?
That situation would be catastrophic, honestly. The decisions have not been made yet, who to vaccinate first, how to identify those individuals, and how to stretch those limited supplies appropriately. And
Let me
it's
ask you a
important to
simple
remember that
question.
it's not just the United States. So there's limited supplies. When I said it would take 2 to 2.5 years to make those, that was assuming there wouldn't be global competition for those limited supplies. Those are not made in the United States, some of them. So
Does a lack of preparation in vaccine supplies make us more vulnerable to future spikes in COVID-19?
Absolutely.
And do we have enough supplies to distribute both the flu vaccine next winter as well as the coronavirus vaccine?
It's going to be extremely challenging.
Do we know yet of the interactions of the full-fledged flu season in combination with COVID-19?
We haven't seen that yet. Luckily, in this spring, flu was winding down when COVID-19 was emerging.
And without adequate supplies to vaccinate all Americans for COVID-19, does this slow down the goal of fully reopening our economy and getting back to the normal that every American wants?
It certainly brings caution and a significant consideration that must be taken into consideration before reopening. We need to make sure that not only the guidelines for reopening are clear to each individual, and each individual follows those guidelines. Otherwise, it puts us all at risk.
So can I ask you a question? And I know you're not political, and certainly we are all trying not to be political. In fact, I'm very proud in our state that our delegation and our governor are working so well together. But Dr. Bright, does this virus give a damn whether a patient is Republican or Democrat?
No, it doesn't. This virus just wants to infect people, and unfortunately, a lot of those people get really sick, and many of them die.
Thank you. I'm so grateful, not just for your knowledge, for your humility, and for your service to our country. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentlewoman yields back. Minority reserves. Pleasure to call on the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Kelly, for her 5 minutes of question.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being here and your patience. As chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Health Brain Trust, I'm deeply concerned by the disparities that this pandemic has brought to light due to our nation's history of discriminatory policy leading to differences in health outcomes for people of color. Time and time again, when resources are scarce, some communities are forced to do without the goods and services they need. You identify multiple situations in which the United States would face a shortage of supplies needed to respond to COVID-19, from masks to swabs and other testing materials, and potentially the supplies to deliver a vaccine when one is ready. During COVID-19, we've seen some states forced to pay significantly more because they're on their own to procure those medical supplies. Not every state or locality can afford to do this. Knowing what we do know about how scarce resources are procured and distributed, what impact will shortages have on lower income communities?
The shortages will impact across all of America, and unfortunately, it actually increases the concern in communities that aren't part of the mainstream or might have lower socioeconomic status. So I think it has a significant chance of increasing the risk in those communities.
How have you seen this impact the devastation of the disease in these communities?
These communities have, the data are showing that they're hit very hard, and we don't actually have the information yet to understand fully what's behind that or why. And it has health status or access to health care or other immunization status or health care status. So we're still learning a lot about that. However, it's really important to think about when we have diagnostic tests and other things available, that they are available to everyone. And many of these tests that we're developing today are very expensive or in very rare supplies. So we need to make sure that we're developing and making available tests that are not just rapid and accurate, but low cost, and so everyone who needs a test can access those tests.
Did you attempt to urge HHS leadership or the administration to consider preparedness, outreach, or targeted resources for these populations? Or are you aware of any HHS administration actions to target resources outreach to these vulnerable groups?
I've had some conversation. There have been some conversations, I should say, focusing on groups that are harder to reach in a different socioeconomic status. I'm not sure that there is a solidified plan in place just yet to make sure that it's more than a conversation.
Doesn't sound like there is. In your testimony, you recommend establishing a national standard and coordinate equitable distribution of equipment and supplies. Will this help to ensure that every community can access the equipment and supplies they need?
That is what's needed.
Will more equitable distribution of equipment and supplies help to address the inequities we're seeing in the impact of COVID-19 on communities of color?
Yeah, absolutely.
And do you feel in the last bill that we passed, we made sure that there was, passed in the bill, better data as far as race, and not just who died, but who was hospitalized and so on and so forth, because we're hoping that better data will inform policy. How do you feel like that'll help?
I think that's very important. I think it's a wise move.
Okay, good. And we're supposed to get a report 21 days from when the president signed the bill, then 30 days, and then 180 days.
I'm not aware of those guidelines. It comes in a different area, but I think reporting and oversight of that is important.
And then lastly, you've been sitting in that seat for a while, but is there anything that we haven't asked you that you want to say?
It's a really important question, and I've thought a lot about that. I think to highlight the things I talked about in my opening statement is we need transparency in the science, and America needs to know the truth. This is a devastating pandemic, and not just for health, but also society, our economy, our jobs, our livelihood. And if we do not take seriously the call for action to put specific things in place, a coordinated national plan for testing and response, and equitable distribution of these limited supplies, and ramp up and prepare for what will be a very devastating fall if we don't have the right supplies in place and raw materials, then this virus will overcome us in significant ways still. So we have limited time. My message is we have limited time. We have the ability to do it. We have the greatest scientific minds in our country to do it. We need to listen to them, put the plan in place, and everyone get busy stopping this virus.
Right. I know it's very, I've had 3 people in my family with it, and I lost my uncle maybe like 10 days ago now from the virus. So it does definitely touch everybody. Thank you, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
The gentlewoman yields back, minority reserve. All right, then we'll go to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Barragan, for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Dr. Bright, one striking aspect of your account in your complaint to the Office of Special Counsel is the contrast between the public updates by the President and Secretary Azar on COVID-19 versus the analysis you and other experts were providing behind the scenes. I'd like to explore this disconnect and ultimately that the administration shared information that I believe was misleading. We need to do this to better understand what happened and how we can ensure that the administration provides the public accurate and constructive information going forward. Dr. Bright, you had learned of the COVID-19 threat by early January, is that correct?
Yes.
And according to your complaint, it was clear to you almost immediately that the, quote, virus was highly contagious, spreading rapidly, and could have a high mortality rate, end quote. Is that correct?
We were learning that from the outbreak in China at the time, yes. And each day we learned more information. It was actually more concerning.
And the World Health Organization confirmed your view that the virus was a big problem in a January 20 call to agencies, including HHS. Over the course of January, you pressed HHS leadership about the urgent need to devote increased resources to address the outbreak. On January 23rd, you briefed Secretary Azar directly that funding, personnel, and clinical specimens, including viruses, were critically necessary to begin development of life-saving medicines needed in the likely event the virus spread beyond Southeast Asia. Yet, on January 24th, in a tweet regarding the virus, the president asserted, quote, it will all work out well, end quote. On January 29th, Secretary Azar reportedly told the president that the epidemic was, quote, under control. And the president echoed that comment publicly the following day. This disconnect between the analysis of public health experts and the public statements by the administration leaders continued through February. Let me give you some more examples. In early February, you continued to raise the alarm bell within HHS about the imminent mass shortages and the lack of preparations for the wave of infections that you saw coming. Thank you for doing that. Yet, in public remarks on February the 10th, President Trump stated, "It looks like by April, in theory, when it gets a little warmer, it miraculously goes away," end quote. Then he added, "I think it's all going to work out good. We only have 11 cases, and they're all getting better," end quote. You have said that experts knew that the number of N95 respirator masks needed to protect healthcare workers and other Americans in a pandemic was close to 3.5 billion. Yet, in testimony on February 25th, Secretary Azar said the U.S. would only need 300 million N95 respirators. That's an order of magnitude so much less than what you stated. Throughout February, you continued your warnings. I would say that your hair was on fire about the dangers of millions of Americans faced from this virus. But on February 26, President Trump characterized the number of cases this way. Quote, "When you have 15 people, and the 15 within a couple of days is going to be down to close to zero, that's a pretty good job you've done," end quote. By March 10th, there were over 1,000 diagnosed COVID-19 cases in the United States, and over 30 deaths had been attributed to the virus in this country. Yet the president that day told the country, quote, "It will go away. Just stay calm. It will go away," end quote. He couldn't have been more wrong. Today we have over 1.4 million cases. Dr. Bright, what impact do you believe that statements by the administration leaders downplaying the COVID-19 crisis throughout February had on the ability of our public health system to mount an effective response to the COVID-19 virus?
I believe Americans need to be told the truth. I believe that the best scientific guidance and advice was not being conveyed to the American public during that time. I believe by not telling America the truth or being fully transparent, regardless of where the information was coming from, people were not as prepared as they could have been and should have been. We did not forewarn people. We did not train people. We did not educate them on social distancing and wearing a mask as we should have in January and February. All of those forewarnings and all those educational opportunities for the American public could have had an impact on further slowing this outbreak and saving more lives.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bright. I want to thank you for sharing your perspective with us today. I hope that I hope that your courage in coming forward helps our country forge a better path than the disastrous course chartered by this administration to date. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Minority reserves. Pleasure to recognize the gentlewoman from Delaware, Ms. Lisa Blunt-Rochester. 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Dr. Bright, so much for your testimony, but also for your courage here today. As you can hear from our colleagues, there is not a person in this room or in this country who hasn't been personally touched by COVID-19. And your statement that we need to be told the truth is probably the most important statement we've heard all day, because we know that if we don't face it, we can't fix it. So I want to personally thank you on behalf of all Americans for your courage to testify before us today. And I want to say that my focus for this hearing is really on 3 things. Number 1, what have we learned? Number 2, what do we need to do now? And number 3, what can we do to prevent or mitigate the risks of an additional wave of COVID-19? It's clear since January of this year that there has been a failure on the part of the administration to use the scientific evidence that's been presented by the nation's top public health officials to take comprehensive, and I'll use that word again, comprehensive, appropriate, and urgent action to respond to COVID-19. One of the most pressing outstanding needs that has yet to be addressed is the need for a national testing strategy. Dr. Bright, in your testimony, you mentioned the need for such a strategy that ensures tests are, among other things, available to everyone who needs them. I, along with Congressman Colin Peterson and Representative Fela from Texas, wrote a letter to the Democratic and the Republican House leadership in the House and the Senate, and we really impressed upon them the need for outlining the importance of a robust testing plan for testing and tracing. And while current testing capacity is 1.6 million diagnostic tests per week, healthcare experts say that we're woefully short of the estimated 30 million tests per week that we need to get America back to work as safely and confidently as possible and to avert or mitigate a second wave of COVID-19, which is one of my biggest concerns. Dr. Bright, what are the immediate steps that HHS needs to be taking to ramp up testing capacity now through the fall, and what targets should they be held accountable for?
I think what's really interesting about the testing story that gets lost in the narrative sometimes is the confusion about the different types of tests. There's an antigen test that tells you if you have the virus in you. There's a PCR test that says if maybe there are fragments of the virus, and there's this antibody test that looks at your antibody titer to try to tell you you've been exposed already, maybe immune to the virus. There's a lot of confusion, and I think the first thing HHS needs to do is determine which of those tests is most important to achieve which objective. If the antigen test is what's needed because it's faster and lower cost and more readily available in some cases, what does it tell Americans? What does it tell employers? What does it tell schools about the potential for an individual who has a positive or negative on that test and their potential to have a different result the next day or later that day? There's a lot of confusion about these tests. So I think the first thing that HHS should do is determine the type of test and how that test would be used effectively. And then make sure that we have enough of those types of tests and they're in the right place, and the people using them know what the data tells them and how to use it effectively. I think there's a lot of confusion there, and they need leadership in HHS to distinguish those challenges and clarify that for the American public. It's not just a test. There are many different tests, they tell you different things.
Thank you, thank you. And why do you think that our nation has struggled with ramping up the testing capacity, unlike other countries? And were there contingencies in place or a backup in light of this situation we're in now?
I think part of the struggle is waiting too late to think about it and to get it started. When we've had conversations with some manufacturers, they've been very creative in how they can ramp up. Another part of the challenge is we've allowed many of these capabilities to be offshored. And so we have much more capability of expanding domestic capacity when it's in our country, and we can ramp up and bring innovation to those companies in the U.S. But if the supply chain is offshore and there's a global need and competition for that supply chain, that also significantly impairs our ability to ramp up.
Again, I just want to thank you so much for the time that you have contributed to our country, but also for your courage to be here right now. Many of us are challenged as Democrats and Republicans to make sure that our country is safe and healthy, and it really is, I don't think I've ever in my lifetime seen anything like this, and it does require us to look back and at the same time look forward and make sure that we have what we need as a country. So I thank you again, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. Does the minority reserve? All right. Then it's a pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for his 5 minutes of questions. Do you have your microphone on?
Yeah, I have it on now.
Good. Now I can hear you. Okay.
I want to thank you, Madam Chairman. Dr. Bright, it's so good to see you. I've been watching you this morning, and it just amazes me about your courage and your insight and your commitment. And I'm just so delighted to be in the same room with you. Your contributions are impressive, and your reports of how the scientific process was pushed aside for short-term political points are extremely troublesome to me and to the American people, I'm sure. I'm absolutely convinced that both you and the Chinese doctor, Dr. Li, the doctor who first raised the alarm over the coronavirus in Wuhan, China, you two will be remembered as two titans of this pandemic. You took the path that was right rather than the path that was easy, and I commend you for it. And that said, Dr. Wright, it's been widely reported that President Obama's White House National Security Council left the administration a detailed, very thorough document on how to proceed to a pandemic. And did you have any input in that playbook?
Yes, sir, we did. A number of our agencies across the government had input in that playbook.
And as far as you know, has any of those recommendations been enacted upon in this administration?
I believe some of those principles have been reviewed and considered, but I think the playbook has changed in this outbreak. I don't think they followed that playbook.
Like you, I think it's critically important that we focus on the path forward. While we must learn from the past and correct injustices as they occur, our response has to be forward-thinking, forward-moving. And I'm the sponsor of a bipartisan COVID-19 Trace Act. I have been working on developing a comprehensive $100 billion strategy for mobile testing and door-to-door tracing. And my legislation, my bipartisan legislation, empower community groups to hire and train and pay workers to engage in testing and contract tracing. It prioritizes hotspots in medically underserved areas, as well as entities who hire locally. And as such, I was very interested in your views on a national testing and tracing strategy. In your testimony, you said, the virus is out there. It's everywhere. We need to be able to find it, to isolate it, and to stop it from affecting more people. And with that, I could not agree with you more. While my question may be outside of the scope of the NIH or BARDA, I believe that it's a question that is relevant to today. And I'd like to hear more about what you, as an expert on pandemic outbreaks, believes should be our national strategy for testing and tracing.
So I think it's important. You're spot on that we need to have a strategy that everyone follows the same strategy to test for where the virus is, who's infected with this virus. And then we have to appropriately isolate that person and quarantine them so they don't infect others. And we rapidly need to trace their contacts to understand who they may have been exposed to and be able to test those individuals. And if they've been infected as well, we need to be able to isolate those. Through a concerted, coordinated effort across the country, we can be able to identify where that virus is, who's been exposed, give those people proper treatment and isolation, and can slow the spread of this virus significantly. But that has to be in a coordinated way. We have to have the right tests and enough of those tests. It's not something we do once and we're done. It's something we have to continually do in a community. So it's not just that we need one test for every person in America. We need multiple tests and the right types of tests. We need the right types of individuals and professionals who know how to use those tests to trace the individual contacts and to isolate that virus and stop it from spreading.
Well, I certainly thank you so very much, and thank you for being here and letting the American people know what really is going on in our nation with this pandemic. I thank you. And Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. There is no request from the, you're out of speakers, okay. It's a pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. O'Halloran, who is a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee And according to our rules, we can, as members of the full committee, we can waive on to a subcommittee. And so we welcome you this afternoon and recognize you for 5 minutes of questions. Put your microphone on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Dr. Bright, thank you for your remarks today, your insight, your knowledge, and your caring for the American people. You have touched on several concerns I share with my colleagues about how the United States has responded to COVID-19. We must address the health crisis head-on if we want to tackle the economic crisis that has overtaken our country. We are going to need a coordinated, as you mentioned, national testing and contact tracing plan spearheaded by the federal government to prevent states from competing with one another for resources and planning for hotspot attacks and other issues that will come up. This is the only way that people will feel safe returning to work, eating at restaurants, enjoying Arizona's public lands, and being out in public and close to others. This flexibility piece is critical, and you can't have that unless you have a coordinated process. In my district, the Navajo Nation has for months been going under this process. And it's 170,000 people. The area is the size of West Virginia. So they're not all gathered in a group. So this fallacy that only urban areas are impacted and that it can't spread very fast. 16 people died yesterday. And in fact, this on a per capita basis, this currently has more cases than any state in the country. And yet this hotspot is still not being addressed in the appropriate way. More resources are needed, and they're needed now, and they were needed more than a month ago when we started trying to get this done. They continue to struggle to see the federal government's promised payments each in a timely manner. It came through finally, but it has to be timely in order to respond. This will bolster the health system and provide people with water, food, and supplies during this time of great crisis. Dr. Bright, as an infectious disease expert, what is the one thing that the federal government must do to ensure that hotspots like Navajo Nation or anywhere else in our country are successfully mitigated in a timely way, that this virus does not continue to spread throughout communities, and to bring back the faith of the citizens of our country to be able to understand that we will respond quickly with the necessary supplies?
Congressman, that's an excellent question. I believe that there's a need to recognize that it is a hot spot and understand the per capita outbreak of a number of infections in different areas and not treat every area in the United States the same. The rural areas, the less dense areas are not the same as a dense city such as New York City. However, you could have just as significant of challenge in a rural area or a less dense area as you described in Arizona. So I think the first recognition is to get the data across the country into the federal government so they can make the right prioritization decisions and allocation, equitable allocation of those limited supplies and resources to areas such as yours with a hotspot area. I don't think there's a full recognition yet of how to define necessarily the hotspots in a standardized way across the country. So we need to have the scientists review this challenge and come up with an equitable distribution and recognition of those areas.
Thank you, Doctor. I want to point out that this enemy goes much faster than one of our jet planes. Our fighters go fast, but this goes microseconds, one person to another, and it passes on and on and on. So I appreciate your comment. But statistics have to be relevant and timely in order to be able to do that, and it needs a central database. Dr. Bright, we are currently seeing the number of COVID-19 tests that are being administered increase nationwide. What major hurdles stand in our way from increasing our testing capacity quickly, moving forward, and how can the federal government address these now or within a quick period of time? It's taken, White Mountain Apache are going through a hot spot right now in my district. They cannot get tests. And they've had 400 cases out of 14,000 people. I mean, this is a critical issue, please.
I still think we need to recognize the importance of the different types of tests. And when we identify those different types of tests are essential for what we need to do to isolate the virus or identify people infected with the virus, then we need to put all efforts into ramping up production of all supplies for those tests. We've found many times that we've ramped up now test production, but we have not thought about the critical reagents that accompany those tests. We haven't thought about the swabs. We're asking equipment, diagnostic equipment that might normally run 100 tests a day to run 10,000 tests a day in a 24-hour period. So there hasn't been a real thought-through plan about how to maintain that equipment. And that equipment now is failing in many places. So as we ramp up capacity to test, and we haven't thought all the way through the raw materials and maintenance of that equipment, those supplies, then we can find ourselves in a few days down the road not having the tests we thought we had, not having the supply we thought we needed. So again, this is where a coordinated strategy and plan for testing comes into place. Not just how to use the test, but how to make sure we're sustaining that supply. How to make sure that we've thought of every component, if it's a swab, if it's a buffer, if it's a lubricant for the instrument itself. Making sure that all of those things are considered and in that national strategy so we don't ramp up in one area and crash in another. We have to ramp up in all areas at once.
Thank you, Doctor, and Madam Chair, I yield.
Seeing no other members to speak, I want to close Dr. Bright. You've been here for just shy of 4 hours of straight testimony. And my observation is the following. I think that you are the finest ambassador in our country for scientists. Your encyclopedic knowledge, the depth and the breadth of it, I think as the American people have listened this morning, that you have given them confidence. You've also issued your warning. And I pray, and I sincerely mean that word, I pray that we will work together successfully so that that window that is closing, we will optimize the time that we have while it is still open. You know, facts are really stubborn things, and sometimes it's uncomfortable to have to deal with the facts that we're facing. But the United States still has more cases, more deaths by far than any other nation on earth. And by that definition, we have, in my view, a profound failure. You have given this committee a roadmap today. And we all have been witnessed your integrity. So thank you for your service to our country. Thank you for your willingness to testify here today. Thank you for your courage, which has raised your blood pressure with all of the what one contends with when you become a high-profile witness. But I think you should rest assured that you've made a difference today. And on behalf of all of my colleagues, I thank you and salute you. And thank you for your family being here as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll ask the, yes?
Just was going to ask if I could be recognized for concluding remarks.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Dr. Burgess,
Thank
you're
you.
recognized.
And as I outlined at the beginning of this hearing, there are a number of things that we do need to look into, and I hope that we will. This crisis has been going on for several months. We had an hour tacked on to a budget hearing at the end of February, and then this is the first glancing blow we've had against this crisis. So I welcome the hearing today. I think it's important. I appreciate Dr. Bright being here. I appreciate him bringing his guest. I do think we need to look into the issue of testing. I simply do not understand how the CDC got so far behind the curve at the beginning, and I would like to know that. But I also feel like there has been, in previous administration, there was an effort to really regulate what are known as laboratory-developed tests and move those away from CLIA-regulated products to FDA-regulated products. And that really did put us behind. The innovators have now stepped up. I'm thankful that they have, but we shouldn't have excluded them in the first place. And I think that was, when we look back on this, that is going to be one of the failings at the federal level. And that's not a recent failing. That goes back to guidances and rules that were issued back in 2012, 2014. As far as testing is concerned and the ancillary supplies, there are tests that might just involve taking a salivary sample. That'd be great. Spit into a cup, not have to deal with one of those obnoxious swabs going halfway down your throat. I suspect those cups are probably in greater supply and more readily available. And then, Dr. Bright, you'll remember I had an interaction with you in March. I've had people pounding on the door with all kinds of ideas. I have people that want to make personal protective equipment. They turn their furniture shop into a PPE manufacturing shop. They had difficulty getting through the bureaucratic cul-de-sacs at the various federal agencies. I've got a man that's got a breathalyzer test for COVID-19. I don't know whether it works. If it does, it's pretty intriguing. A mobile unit about the size of a bread box that you could take from place to place. You simply blow into a tube and would have to have more straws. We've outlawed them recently, but that could be dealt with. There are some innovative things out on the horizon. The vaccine worries me too, because I recognize there's some illnesses for which we have never found a vaccine. H1N1, and I realize that's different because that was a flu vaccine, but that did happen in about 8 months, if I recall correctly. The outbreak happened at spring break. We didn't know if we were going to be able to open the schools in September, but the vaccine was generally available mid-September to early October, depending on what part of the country you were in. So that success story gives me some hope that perhaps there is going to be light at the end of this tunnel in the form of a vaccine. But I do welcome that we had the hearing today. I look forward to a number of additional hearings. The ranking member of the full committee was quite correct to invoke Rule 11. We will keep that as an option going forward. And I thank our witnesses for being here today, and I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you again, Dr. Bright. And the first panel has completed testimony, and I just ask the staff to prepare the table for our next witness, and then we will begin in just a few minutes. at this point, the ranking member to welcome our guest because he is his constituent. So to Dr. Burgess.
Always good to welcome a Texan to our committee. It's always a good day. We have a Texan at the witness stand. We know we're going to hear the truth. I will say I've been on this committee since 2005. In my second term on the committee, in the year that started 2007, then Chairman Dingell had a hearing on the amount of active pharmaceutical ingredient that we imported from other places, in particular China. Shortly after that, we had a problem with heparin contamination. We've had a number of hearings on this with lead-based toys, melamine in our pet food. And there's been a number of concerns about why we continue to use a supply chain when from time to time it's detrimental to us. So if there's any bright spot in this current crisis that we're in, it may be that finally, after 13 or 14 years, we seriously move to make stuff here, be our providers for ourselves, and quite frankly, America first really should mean something. But I welcome you here today, Mr. Bowen. We're anxious to hear what you have to say.
I think made in America. Anyway, welcome, Mr. Bowen, and you have the floor now. You have 5 minutes for your testimony. If you want to place your statement in the record and just speak or read, it's up to you. But welcome and thank you for joining us today. It's already afternoon. You need to turn your microphone on.
Good morning, Chairwoman Eshoo and Ranking Member Burgess. Thank you for your invitation. It's my pleasure to testify. My name is Michael Bowen, and I am the Executive Vice President of Prestige Ameritech of North Richland Hills, Texas. And I have been in the medical industry since 1986 and with Prestige Ameritech since 2006. Prestige Ameritech was founded by President and CEO Dan Reese in 2005. I'm going to give a brief overview of my interactions with BARDA and its directors, but first I'll give you some pertinent mask industry history. Until 2004, 90% of all surgical masks worn, and I'm including surgical respirators, were domestically made. That year, or around that year, all of the major domestic mask sellers switched from selling domestically made masks to selling imported masks. Prestige Ameritech, who was founded in 2005, recognized this as a security issue in 2006. We thought that once America's hospitals learned that their mask supplies were subject to diversion by foreign governments during pandemics, they would switch back to US-made masks. We were wrong. In November of 2007, we received a phone call from BARDA asking for a tour of our mask factory. BARDA was acting on George W. Bush's Presidential Directive 21, the purpose of which was to review America's disaster plans. Brenda Hayden with BARDA gave a presentation which showed that BARDA was concerned about the foreign-controlled mask supply. We were thrilled that BARDA had discovered the issue until Brenda said that BARDA was only charged with studying the problem. We were disappointed, but we took consolation in the fact that finally a federal agency knew that the mask supply was in danger. We were very happy to have an ally. 2 years later, I received a call from Brenda Hayden. She started the conversation by saying, "We have a situation." Her serious tone caused me to ask her if she was talking about a pandemic, and she said yes. She asked if we could ramp up production, and I said yes. We built more machines, bought an abandoned Kimberly-Clark mask factory, tripled our workforce. America's hospitals needed us, and we rose to the occasion. We told them about the high cost of ramping up, and they said they would stay with us. Unfortunately, most returned to buying cheaper foreign-made masks when they became available. The company survived by laying off the 150 people who helped save the U.S. mask supply, by taking pay cuts, and by taking on more investors. The H1N1 pandemic, this is 2009, 2010, wasn't severe enough to cause the foreign health officials to cut off mask shipments to America, so our predictions didn't come true yet. In a weakened state but undaunted, Prestige Ameritech continued saying that the U.S. mask supply was headed for failure. We just didn't know when. In 2004, to give my security story more issue, I formed the Secure Mask Supply Association. You can find it at securemasksupply.org. Paraphrasing Ben Franklin, I told 3 competing domestic mask makers that if we didn't hang together, we would hang separately, as China was poised to put all of us out of business and put the country at even greater risk. Crosstex, Gerson, and Medicom, all with domestic mask-making factories, agreed and joined the SMSA. Unfortunately, the Secure Mask Supply Association's warnings were also unheeded. During my quest to secure the U.S. mask supply, I had the privilege of working with 3 BARDA directors, Dr. Robin Robinson, Dr. Richard Hatchett, and Dr. Rick Bright. They were helpful, and they encouraged me to continue warning people about the mask supply. I'll say a little bit more about that. After years of doing this, I quit many times, and the only reason I kept doing it is because of the directors of BARDA. They would encourage me and ask me not to quit. They said that they would express their concerns about the mask supply to anyone that I could get to call them, anyone except reporters. They weren't allowed to talk to reporters, which was very frustrating to me. They also weren't allowed to endorse the Secure Mask Supply Association. Dr. Robinson was going to do so until HHS attorneys told him that it could cost him his job. He called me personally on vacation to tell me that. I can confirm that the emails in Dr. Bright's complaint are mine. They are merely the latest of 13 years of emails I sent to BARDA in an effort to get HHS to understand that the U.S. mask supply was destined for failure. Robinson, Hatchett, and Bright all wanted to remedy the problem. In my opinion, they didn't have enough authority. Their hearts were in the right places. America was told after 9/11 that governmental silos had been torn down so that different federal agencies could work together for national securities. But I didn't see any of that. The DOD, the VA, the CDC, and HHS could have worked together to secure America's mask supply. I had suggested this to BARDA and to the CDC on several occasions. I will be happy to answer any questions that you have about Prestige Ameritech, the U.S. mask supply, or my interactions with BARDA, the CDC, or Rick Bright. And again, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bowen, again for traveling across the country to be with us and for your testimony. We'll now move to member questions, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. You were already touched on your acknowledgement of your emails or description about your actions that were in Dr. Bright's complaint, so I'll move past that. To the best of your knowledge, is the section of Dr. Bright's complaint about the mask supply accurate?
Yes.
Should HHS and the administration have been able to foresee, in your view, the mask shortages caused by the pandemic?
Yes.
How many of your mask lines are not activated right now?
4.
4. My goodness. And as we have a run on supplies, you have 4 lines that could be working and manufacturing high-grade masks for those that need them in our country.
Yes, but not like turning on a light switch. It's a very large project.
And just spend a moment to tell us what it takes to bring those up.
Well, the machines were built
If you were
in
to receive orders now to activate those lines, explain that to us. And how many more masks could you be manufacturing right now?
We could be making about 7 million N95 respirators a month. However, again,
Did you say a month?
it's, yes, a month.
So say that again, the number of masks?
7 million N95 respirators per month. But again, it's not like turning on a switch. We didn't build these particular machines. They were from China, and we got them in an acquisition several years ago. So my email to Rick Bright, in that email I said, I think we're in trouble. We have these machines. It would be expensive and hard to get them going, but if this is going to be bad, that could happen. So that was my offer.
Very often, especially for lawyers in courtrooms and elsewhere, when you're going to ask a question, they say you should know the answer. I think I know the answer to this question, but I want to hear your view on it. We've allowed this supply, this very important supply of protective articles to other countries. Do you believe it's because of saving nickels, dimes, and quarters?
I call it chasing pennies to China.
Mm-hmm.
It's that insistence.
And look what it has cost us.
It's cost us lives.
And it cost us lives. It's cost us lives. If there's someone that would like me to yield the rest of my time, I'd be glad to. If not, we can go to the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Walden.
Well,
thank you, Mr. Bowen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll let you reset the clock too, so I don't go over my allotted time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There we go. And Ms. Bowen, thank you. Thank you for being here. And I appreciate your testimony, which I read last night. Toward the end of the last panel, I received a copy of an email that you sent to Dr. Bright on January 31st of this year. This email appears to be the one included in Dr. Bright's complaint, though it is one of the exhibits that was not publicly posted by the Washington Post, interestingly enough. Here's what the complaint says. 2 days later, Mr. Bowen of Prestige Ameritech sent yet another email to Dr. Bright and Dr. Wolf, once again issuing a dire warning about the imminent mass shortage. Among other things, he advised, and I quote, "This week we sent 1,000 masks to China and Hong Kong." Now, I believe your email actually says 1 million masks to China and Hong Kong. He continued, quote, "In all my years of predicting the U.S. mask supply would one day collapse, I never pictured myself selling masks to China. I have it from 2 reliable sources. China's begun telling Chinese mask makers not to let masks leave China," close quote. He concluded, "I think China will cut off masks to the USA. If so, U.S. hospitals are going to have a very rough time, as up to half the supply is made in China. A horrible situation will become unbearable." That's the
That is my email, yes, sir.
And that's your email, okay. In the complaint, this is cited as an email from L. Wolf to R. Bright on January 29, 2020. I think that citation is obviously wrong, since even the complaint acknowledges that it's an email from you, Mr. Bowen, to Dr. Bright, right?
That's
your email.
That was my email. I don't know how it got to him, but I mean, I don't know.
How it got to him.
Yeah, I don't know what emails chain you're looking at, but yes, sir, that was my email.
Well, I was reading from Mr. Bright's complaint, and I just received, I think, what appears to be a copy of this email. I think it's cited wrong in the complaint. The email I received is dated January 31st, 2020. It includes all the language that I just read to you from the complaint, and this is exactly why the committee not only needs all the exhibits cited by Dr. Bright, not just the ones selectively obtained by the Washington Post, and needs the full email chains, not just the selective excerpts from Dr. Bright. Because this document also says, and I will quote, this is your email to Dr. Bright and to Laura Wolf. It says, and I quote, my government strategy is to help the U.S. government if and only if the VA and DOD become my customers after this thing is over.
Yes, sir.
So, Madam Chair, I'd like to submit the email for the record. We'll send you an electronic copy as per our agreements here. Now, Mr. Cohen, Bowen, I'm sorry. You said you have, you want to help U.S. government, you want to help Americans get the mask. Yet it appears that there seems to be a condition here. I assume that's because in the past you ramped up, things went away, people bought from other manufacturers. And so here you're saying, and I have it here in the email, my strategy is to help my existing customers and only bring on new customers who are willing to sign a long-term contract. My government strategy is to help the U.S. government if and only if the VA and DOD become my customers after this thing is over. And here we were in a crisis as masks were going overseas. Now, the U.S. government's not your only purchaser, right?
U.S. government has never bought from me except during a pandemic, sir.
Okay,
And that email and that statement was basically saying that I don't want the government to only call me in a pandemic.
Okay.
Give me business during peacetime so that I can survive to help you during a pandemic.
Did you ever ask for a sole source contract?
I have bid on the DOD and the VA business, and I continually lose to masks that are made in Mexico because the DOD does not obey the Berry Amendment. They buy foreign masks made in Mexico because Mexico is a friend of ours and is called a TAA-compliant country.
Were your masks NIOSH 95
make the decision
approved?
based on price,
How
not
long,
national security.
Sir, if I could reclaim my time. How long, you said you couldn't turn on these lines of manufacturing very quickly. How long, if you got a big order from the government today, would it take you to produce masks?
3 or 4 months, and the government wants to do that right now. HHS is asking me to do that.
And it will take you 3 to 4 months?
Yes, I told them it's going to take 3 or 4 months. They only want masks to the end of the year, so I would have to hire 100 people, train 100 people, and then fire them at the end of the program. I'm not going to do that. Again, I don't want the government to only deal with me when
Your time
there's
has
a
expired,
pandemic.
Madam Chair. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. It's a pleasure to recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you. Let me get this down. Voila. Thank you, Mr. Bowen. I've been listening to your, and thank you, Madam Chair. This is an excellent hearing, and it's an issue that we need to focus on because it has repercussions that just continue and continue. Every day I hear from my constituents, including doctors and nurses serving on the front lines of this pandemic, about the dire shortages of personal protective equipment and therapeutics, PPEs, as they call them. Recently, I helped author the Preventing Drug Shortages Act with several of my colleagues on this subcommittee, provisions which were included in the recently enacted CARES Act. This all ties together. I've used my role as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee to cut through red tape and bring much-needed supplies like 100,000 antibody tests for New York City from China. All these actions, as you point out, Mr. Bowen, are symptoms of a larger problem. Most U.S. medical products are manufactured abroad. And as this pandemic has highlighted, this leaves the United States vulnerable in public health crises and obviously poses a national security threat, the way I look at it. So, Mr. Bowen, as we can tell this afternoon and reading all about you, things you've said, things you've written, you've certainly been a leading advocate for this issue, specifically as it pertains to face masks, which have never been more in demand than now. Mine over there. In your written testimony, you note that in 2004, major domestic surgical mask sellers switched from making surgical masks domestically to importing them. I know you spoke a little bit about it, but could you go into more detail and explain what prompted this change?
Mask companies wanting to make more profit. So they go to countries, well, it's not just mask companies, it's people who are in the hospital industry who are competing for contracts, for supplies. And it's a bid type situation most of the time. And the way you make products cheaply is to make them in China and Mexico and other places. So that's why the U.S. mask supply left. It wasn't a coordinated effort. It was a bunch of companies coincidentally deciding to save money at the same time and destroying maybe 4,000 jobs in America and putting the U.S. mask supply under foreign control. And that's been my message since 2006, actually.
Well, it's really unbelievable because it isn't just foreign control. It's a very large degree to China control. When we look at, again, I'm chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, when we look at the geopolitical parts of the world, China is probably the biggest adversary to the United States. So not only are we leaving it in their hands, we're leaving it in the hands of an adversary, and we're sort of beholden to that country. And I cannot think of much that's more dangerous than that. So I'm sure you agree.
China controls most of the world's mask supply. China can sell a box of masks for $1 a box. Or let me say this, China sells $1 a box of masks for $1. I don't think anybody's making any profit doing that because I sell them for about $5. So their prices are so cheap that they've captured most of the world's mask market.
Does their government subsidize the Chinese government, the Beijing government?
I don't know that. I don't know. All I know is their masks cost less than the materials. If I take my labor costs totally out, I'm still nowhere near the cost of their products.
Do the Chinese masks meet our standards?
Some do, some don't.
What steps can the federal government take to incentivize more medical manufacturing of critical equipment like surgical face masks in the United States?
Well, as in a letter that I sent to President Obama, I don't think it requires money. I think it requires the government saying it's a national security problem. It requires the CDC telling America's hospitals they are too dependent on foreign-made masks and put them in legal liability. They have to protect their patients and staff. If in a public forum like this, you say, this is a national security issue, then those hospitals' attorneys are probably going to get on the ball and tell their hospitals to buy American-made products. And they don't cost that much. The whole market is only a couple of $100 million. This whole problem, this is a $30 million problem, folks, just for people trying to save pennies across the whole United States. It's not some multi-billion-dollar problem.
Could you repeat that again and lean forward into that microphone so that everybody hears it again?
I said this is a $30 million problem. It's not billions and billions of dollars. I've never asked for money. In a letter to President Obama, and I wrote President Trump as well, but in a letter to President Obama, I said that this isn't about money. This is about information. Tell America's hospitals that they are going to be in a position to not be able to protect their staff and their patients. And their attorneys, those hospital attorneys, will tell their hospital to buy American-made masks. I don't need your money. Don't need subsidies. Just tell people about the problem. And that was my problem with BARDA. Not my problem. BARDA wanted to do it. They weren't allowed to do it. This issue needed publicity. I tried to get them to talk to the Infection Control Prevention magazine, Infection Control Today, sorry. I wanted them to talk to the New York Times. Every time we had some kind of a flu bump, I wanted them to be able to talk, and they couldn't do it.
Well, thank you very much. Your testimony has certainly been very enlightening. I know the chairwoman and I were kind of looking at each other and almost in disbelief, and I certainly think that this is something that Congress has to get involved with, and sooner the better. Thank you very much for your testimony.
Can I point out something?
Sure.
You know, I watched all of this in a room a little while ago, and it seemed like everybody who was beating up on on Mr. Bright. Dr. Bright was a Republican, and everybody who was defending him was a Democrat. I'm a Republican. I voted for President Trump. And I admire Dr. Bright. I don't know what he did in all of his other activities, but I think everything I've heard and every time I've talked to him and everything he said here made a lot of sense, and I believe him.
Thank you, Mr. Bowen. I now have the pleasure of recognizing the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Appreciate you coming today. I have a manufacturing background myself, and I know that the president's asked General Motors and Ford to make ventilators, and everybody's business is their business. They make decisions based on what's right for their business. But during the pandemic, there is an upload, and if every business person says we're not going to adjust our lines for a pandemic, and understand Ford and GM have different access to capital than some others, just something that everybody needs to be concerned about, because in a pandemic you do have increased orders, but I understand you want some long-term guarantees as well. But there are a lot of people making decisions. There are people now with their businesses shut down because of what's going on in the pandemic. But I'm just trying to understand the mask manufacture process, and so
if you can.
So my questions are, what type of masks do you manufacture, and do they represent the totality of mask variations sought by the Strategic National Stockpile? And if you can get all these questions in, do you make all masks that are in demand that other domestic product producers make?
The only mask that I don't make is a cone-style mask, the hard cone style. All the masks like you all are wearing, we make all of those, and we make N95 respirators, yes.
You do all the N95s?
Our factory used to make 87% of the U.S. mask supply.
So as you know, the Strategic National Stockpile procedure procures medical countermeasures and other supplies to be deployed in a public health agency.
Yes, sir.
I understand you worked with Dr. Bright at BARDA to get federal funding to produce masks. Did you have any conversations with Stephen Adams, the acting director of the Strategic National Stockpile?
Let me go back before that. On the Strategic National Stockpile, I met with Greg Burrell face-to-face 5 or 6 years ago. And Greg Burrell had no problem whatsoever buying Chinese masks. And I had a conversation with him in the hallway after a meeting when I said, don't you find this a problem that America is dependent on Chinese masks? And he said, no, I don't. And as far as Mr. Adams, I believe I may have emailed him. I don't know, sir. The last 100 days, I've talked to so many people. I don't know what day it is most of the time.
So you thought it was necessary to go through Dr. Bright? You couldn't get anybody else to listen to? I mean, Dr. Bright.
Well, no. You got it all wrong. First of all, I wasn't looking for
business. Wrong. I'm just trying to find the information.
Okay.
So, yeah.
I wasn't looking for business. I opened my email. I don't need your business. My phones are ringing off the wall. I thought of BARDA, Dr. Robinson, Dr. Hatchett, and Dr. Bright. I thought of them as brothers in arms. I knew they couldn't buy my products. I knew that. But they were the only people who believed it. I would like everybody to go to YouTube, put in Michael Burgess and Prestige Ameritech. You'll see Mr. Burgess talking at our factory 10 years ago. You'll see him say that only 10% of the mask supply is made in the United States. I talked to Michael Burgess, Ron Wright, Joe Barton, Patrick Leahy, my associate Matt Conlon talked to Chuck Schumer. I wrote Barack Obama 20 letters, wrote President Trump and everybody in his early administration. Defense Secretary Mattis, General Jeffrey Clark, Nicole Lurie, Anita Patel with CDC, National Academies of Science, Greg Burrell, hundreds of hospitals, hospital purchasing groups, the Hospital Risk Managers Association. Hospital Risk Managers Association told them the mask supply was going to collapse. This is a risk. Nobody listened. Association of Operating Room Nurses, the Defense Department, the Veterans Department, Texas Governor Rick Perry, State Texas Rep Bill Zedler. By the way, Bill Zedler got it. dozens of reporters. I've been on every news show. I've done this for 13 years. Nobody listened. And my conscience is clean, Mr. Guthrie. I've been working on this damn issue for 13 years, trying to save lives. Nobody listened, and now I'm not going to take any of this, what you're trying to do.
I'm not sure what I'm trying to do. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to find out about who you had talked with and move forward. So, well, the issue is that we do have to figure out what's strategic and where to move forward. And there is a lot of stuff, not just masks, a lot of stuff come from China, a lot of our pharmaceuticals and stuff moving forward. And that's something this committee needs to dig in to move forward and figure out what's moving forward. But I'm not sure what you were accusing me of trying to do, but I'll yell back. I apologize if I offended you. I didn't intend to.
The gentleman yields back. I think my colleagues will agree that my description of Mr. Bowen is that he's a force of nature. I mean, he has refused to give up since what year? 2006? You began your crusade?
2006.
2006. It's a pleasure to recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Matsui, for her 5 minutes of questions.